Across the West, the graves are quiet. Unmarked mounds in forgotten clearings, lonely stones on windswept hillsides, fenced plots behind decaying churches. Each one belongs to a man or woman who rode for a dream. Each one is a receipt for Dutch van der Linde's promises. Because before Dutch died on that cold mountaintop, his dream killed almost everyone who ever believed in him. This is not just a story of one outlaw gang. It is a story of freedom turned into a cage, of family turned into leverage, of loyalty twisted into a weapon. From its humble beginnings in the rough 1870s to its scattered end in the early 1900s, the van der Linde gang became the living embodiment of a changing America, trapped between the open horizon and the march of civilization. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. Dutch promised a way to outrun both. Across 3 decades, from the first cons Dutch and Hosea ran together to the last stand among the snow and dynamite, the gang's history mirrors the frontier itself. In the beginning, there is an idealistic philosophy, a code that claims to rob the rich and corrupt, to strike back at a rigged system, to build a chosen family out of every lost soul the world throws away. In the end, there is paranoia, betrayal, and bodies left behind in towns whose names fade faster than the blood on their streets. This saga stretches from dusty crossroads in the 1870s to industrial skylines stained with smoke in the early 1900s, from campfires under endless stars to electric lights in St. Denis and Blackwater. Freedom versus civilization, wilderness versus industry, outlaw honor versus systemic corruption. Every choice the gang makes is pinned between those poles. Dutch learns to speak that language fluently, praising loyalty while demanding obedience, preaching family while gambling with lives, invoking justice while sending his own people into the line of fire. Some die early, off-screen, their stories buried in throwaway lines and distant gravestones. Jenny, Davy, Mac, casualties of the Blackwater disaster, the original sin that haunts 1899. Others fall in moments burned into memory. Hosea gunned down as a distraction, Lenny shot on a St. Denis rooftop, Sean sniped mid-sentence in Rhodes after Dutch ignores every warning. How many times does a man die for Dutch before the bullets finally reach him? This is the promise. The entire lore of every gang member who died for Dutch's vision, from the very beginning to the last echo of gunfire. Not just the scenes shown on screen, but the connective tissue hidden in campfire stories, journal entries, and carved names in stone. All of it woven into one continuous tragic narrative arc. Because the story of the van der Linde gang does not begin with Dutch's death. It begins with the first person who chose to trust him. And to tell it properly, the tale must start long before Blackwater, with two men meeting on a dusty road, each one trying to rob the other, and both walking away with a partner instead of a corpse. That partnership becomes the measure of everything that follows, because this is not just a story of outlaws on the run. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a found family that keeps stepping in front of bullets for a man who promises freedom and delivers graves. This saga will trace, in order, the complete path of every major van der Linde member whose death is bound to Dutch's decisions, his philosophy, or his failures as a leader. From the first nameless bodies left in the wake of Blackwater, to the quiet headstones scattered across the frontier, each fallen member will be followed from first appearance to final breath. Not just how they die, but how Dutch's voice, Dutch's plans, and Dutch's dream push them there. To die for Dutch in this world is not simply to fall near him in a gunfight. It means dying because of his plans, his stubbornness, his lies, or the gravitational pull of his idealistic vision of freedom. Some are marched into suicidal heists he insists will fix everything. Some stay when every instinct tells them to run, because he once saved them, or taught them, or gave them a place to belong. Others are destroyed more slowly, their sense of self eroded by the need to believe that Dutch van der Linde cannot be wrong. The structure of this tale reflects that slow erosion. It begins at the very beginning, from its humble beginnings with two con men laughing in the dark, and follows the gang through its formation, expansion, fracture, and collapse. Dutch and Hosea will stand at the center as the architects of an outlaw family that claims to rob the rich and corrupt. Arthur and John will emerge as the living embodiment of that family's split soul. One man who keeps dying inside for Dutch long before his body falls, and another who must survive long enough to carry the legacy into Red Dead Redemption. Around them, the circle will widen. Sean, Lenny, Bill, Javier, Charles, Sadie, Micah, and others will move from names in a camp roster to fully realized lives, each tested by Dutch's shifting philosophy as the world was changing and the old ways were dying. The Blackwater ferry job, the Rhodes feud, the St. Denis bank heist, Guarma, and Beaver Hollow will be treated not as disconnected set pieces, but as steps in a single, tightening noose. To tell this story in the truest sense, The narrative will braid together lore from Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2, campfire conversations, offhand comments on horseback, graves on lonely hillsides, letters tucked into drawers, and the environmental scars left where the gang once camped. Every grave will be read as a receipt for one of Dutch's choices. And to understand each of those graves, the story must begin before there is a gang at all, before Arthur or John, before Blackwater or St. Denis. It starts with two drifting conmen on a road in the 1870s, each one ready to rob the other, and both about to invent a philosophy that will outlive them and kill almost everyone who believes in it. The first meeting of Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews is a story of almost comic miscalculation. Two drifters on a quiet 1870s road, one stagecoach rolling toward them, and each man convinced he has finally found an easy mark. No Pinkertons, no bloodbath, no grand showdown. Just two predators circling the same prey, and not yet realizing they are staring into a mirror. Dutch steps into the road with that theatrical confidence that will one day command a campfire and a battlefield. Hat tipped, voice smooth, he plays the gentleman in distress, spinning a tale about a broken wheel a mile back and a wounded friend in need of help. Hosea, already hidden near the coach, watches this stranger work and instantly recognizes a fellow professional. The posture, the cadence, the way Dutch studies the driver's hands on the reins. This is not some desperate outlaw. This is a craftsman. Hosea has his own play ready. When Dutch waves the coach down, Hosea emerges as if by chance, pretending to be another traveler, all weary charm and apologetic smiles. In the truest sense, it is a meet-cute crime. Dutch thinks Hosea is a gullible passerby he can use to sell the story. Hosea thinks Dutch is an over-eager amateur he can outmaneuver. The driver, sensing something wrong, panics. The horses rear. The whole thing collapses into a tangle of curses, flying luggage, and a coach that bolts down the road with all the money still inside. The world was changing, but in that moment it changes for them with laughter, not gunfire. Standing in the dust of a failed robbery, each man reaches for his gun, then hesitates. There is that tiny beat where this could end the usual way, with two dead outlaws on a nameless road. Instead, Dutch starts to laugh. Hosea follows. They laugh at the absurdity, at their own arrogance, at how close they came to killing the only person who truly understands them. Around the first shared campfire, their outlines sharpen. Dutch is younger, bookish beneath the bravado, quoting scraps of philosophy and half-remembered speeches about freedom, civilization, and the tyranny of the railroads. Hosea is older and wryer, a master con artist who reads people the way others read ledgers, cutting through Dutch's rhetoric with dry questions that land harder than bullets. Dutch talks about building something better from its humble beginnings, an outlaw family that robs the rich and corrupt. Hosea nods, not because he believes every word, but because he believes in the man saying them. They trade stories of crooked sheriffs, railroad barons, and towns that pretend to be civilized while bleeding the poor. By dawn, conflict has turned to partnership. Dutch the dreamer, Hosea the realist, bound by a shared hatred of hypocrisy and a shared love of the game. This is the very beginning of the van der Linde philosophy, the living embodiment of a balance that will hold the gang together for decades. And when that balance breaks, when one half of this quiet pact is gone, Dutch's dream will stop saving lost souls and start destroying them. The next man to feel that shift is a 14-year-old thief named Arthur Morgan, walking unknowingly toward the fire. Arthur steps toward Dutch's fire because Dutch promises it is not a fire at all, but a light in the darkness. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is not sold as a criminal enterprise. It is sold as a philosophy, a story of freedom and dignity in a world that is closing its fist. Dutch's stated ideals sound almost noble. He speaks of a life beyond the reach of corrupt government agents and greedy rail barons, beyond banks that own the land and the men who work it. Civilization, in his telling, is a con game played by the powerful, and the only honest answer is to steal from those who stole first. Rob a train owned by a monopoly, rob a bank that funds land grabs, rob the men who write the laws. Crime becomes rebellion, and every robbery is framed as a blow for the common folk who never see a cent. But Dutch does not just offer a cause, he offers a home. In the truest sense, he builds the gang as a traveling experiment in how the world could be different. A camp where race, class, and past sins matter less than loyalty. Where a woman who killed her husband, a native warrior, a drunk ex-soldier, and a 14-year-old pickpocket can eat at the same table. He calls them family. He calls the camp their own little world. To the broken, he offers belonging. To the lost soul, he offers a role. To the desperate, he offers purpose. Yet from the very beginning, the contradictions are there. Dutch preaches freedom, but demands absolute obedience when his plans are questioned. He rails against exploitation, yet he knows exactly which wounds to press when he needs someone to ride into gunfire. He claims to hate senseless killing, but every grand gesture leaves bodies in the dust. Lawmen on the tracks, guards in the mud, O'Driscolls hanging from trees. How many dead strangers are written off as the price of staying free? His rhetoric grows almost religious. Dutch quotes writers he half remembers, sprinkles Shakespeare and political theory into campfire speeches, and spins parables about how the old ways were dying under smokestacks and telegraph wires. The gang's life on the road becomes the living embodiment of his gospel. No bosses, no landlords, only the open sky and the gun at the hip. He casts himself, not as a leader hungry for power, but as a prophet of another way to live outside civilization. This is the gospel every future grave in this story pays for. Hosea believes in the dream with clear eyes, Arthur with wounded loyalty, Lenny with idealistic fire, even Micah with venomous flattery. Each one buys into Dutch's beautiful vision of freedom. Each one trusts that this family and this philosophy will save them. In time, every corpse tied to the van der Linde name will stand as a receipt for one of Dutch's promises, a quiet proof that his dream is as deadly as the world he claims to resist. And the first to pay that price, long before Blackwater, will be the children Dutch raises in his image. Those children did not grow up under Dutch alone. From the very beginning, there was another gravity in that world, pulling in the opposite direction. His name was Hosea Matthews, and if Dutch was the dreamer, Hosea was the man who kept the dream from floating completely off the ground. Hosea was older, sharper, and far more tired than Dutch would ever admit to being. He had run cons across the country long before the van der Linde gang had a name, selling snake oil, fake bonds, and impossible investments to men who thought civilization made them too smart to be fooled. Hosea had seen every scam and every self-delusion, from preachers selling salvation to politicians selling progress. That history made him skeptical of grand philosophies, but fiercely loyal to the few people he chose. Dutch was one of them. Arthur became another. From its humble beginnings, that partnership shaped the gang's daily reality. Dutch talked about freedom, about resisting a rigged system. Hosea turned those speeches into practical work. He pushed for cons over shootouts, for robberies planned in detail rather than violent improvisation. A staged coach robbery here, a fake land deal there, a quiet burglary when the family was out of town. Hosea understood that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that the only way an outlaw family survived was by being clever enough not to draw every gun in the territory. In private, he was the only one who could truly stand up to Dutch. Around the campfire, Dutch was the living embodiment of charisma. In the tent, with the lantern low, Hosea became his conscience. He questioned the risky plans, dissected the holes in Dutch's logic, reminded him that there were children in camp and wounded men who could not outrun Pinkertons. When Dutch's ego swelled, Hosea punctured it with a quiet, cutting remark, a raised eyebrow, a simple question. For them or for you? How many disasters were quietly averted in those conversations? To the rest of the gang, Hosea was a father in the truest sense. He taught Arthur to track game and read tracks instead of just reading Dutch's speeches. He showed John when to talk his way out instead of drawing a gun. He encouraged Lenny's reading, Charles's restraint, even Sadie's controlled fury, turning raw pain into survival rather than blind revenge. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, Hosea's lessons were the thin line between outlaw and murderer. But that line would not hold forever. As Dutch's pride hardened into delusion and Micah's poison began to whisper in his ear, Hosea's influence started to fade. The jobs grew louder, the plans grew thinner, the blood spilled more freely. The quiet coach cons gave way to Blackwater's ferry, to St. Denis's bank, to the kind of grand gestures Hosea had always feared. And when the counterweight is removed, what happens to the scales? Those who die first for Dutch are often the very souls Hosea once shielded, the proof that without him, Dutch's philosophy will demand payment in lives. But before the bodies start falling in earnest, there is the dream itself, alive and warm around a campfire. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is not just a crew of thieves moving from score to score. It is presented, in the truest sense, as a wandering experiment in freedom and family, a story of outlaws trying to build their own civilization on the run. Early camp life feels almost peaceful. Tin plates scrape as everyone shares one pot, coffee boils black and strong, and the nights stretch long with stories and arguments instead of gunfire. Dutch reads from tattered books, quoting philosophers and poets, turning their words into ammunition for his own philosophy. The world was changing, he insists. The old ways were dying, and only those brave enough to live outside the law will stay truly free. Around the same fire, Hosea quietly teaches a different curriculum: how to spot a mark, how to lie without flinching, how to walk away before trouble arrives. In those years, the gang is a roaming commune as much as a criminal outfit, a caravan of wagons and wounded hearts. Dutch and Hosea do not simply hire guns, they collect lost souls, runaways fleeing beatings, widows with nowhere to go, drifters who tried honest work and were chewed up by the same civilization Dutch condemns. A beaten ranch hand becomes a guard, a scarred widow becomes a scout, a former maid becomes the camp's backbone. Each is given food, a bedroll, and, more importantly, a story about who they are now. Recruitment is as emotional as it is practical. Dutch offers a new name under his banner, a place where past sins are washed away by present loyalty. Hosea reinforces the illusion with gentle cons and small victories, proving that together, this family can outwit sheriffs, railroad barons, and the industrialists choking the frontier. Is it any wonder so many believe? To a drifter who has lost everything, Dutch's tent feels like a church without walls. Morally, they stand in a carefully drawn gray. They rob, cheat, and steal, but in their minds they strike back at a rigged system that has already stolen far more. A train job is framed as justice against a callous magnate. A stagecoach robbery is a tax on the rich who never see the faces they ruin. This framing is the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy: crime recast as rebellion, greed repainted as righteous vengeance. That story becomes a shield. It lets each member rationalize the blood on their hands as necessary, even noble. They are not killing for money, they are killing for freedom, for family, for a dream that promises a place beyond the reach of banks and Pinkertons. So when Dutch asks for risk, when Hosea sketches another plan, they step forward. Who would not die for a cause that claims to have saved their life already? Among the first children taken into this experiment is a boy caught stealing on the streets, angry and half-feral. His name is Arthur Morgan, and his entire life, and death, will be defined by Dutch's dream. Arthur Morgan's story does not begin with a gang or a grand philosophy. It begins with a boy watching the world fall apart around a campfire and a hangman's rope. From its humble beginnings, it is already a story of failure, of absence, of a child pushed toward the edge of civilization with no one to pull him back. He is born to Beatrice and Lyle Morgan, and even that sounds more stable than it is. Lyle is a small-time outlaw, a petty thief drifting from job to job, always chasing the next easy dollar and running from the last bad decision. The family lives on the fringes, moving between shacks, camps, and backwater towns where the law is thin and mercy thinner. Violence is not an event in Arthur's early life, it is the atmosphere. Men argue over cards, guns come out over debts, and the boy learns that freedom, in this world, often means no one is coming to help. Beatrice dies when Arthur is still young, another nameless grave in an uncaring landscape, and Lyle does not suddenly become a better father. He teaches Arthur what he knows: how to steal a horse, how to read a man's pockets, how to slip a wallet from a coat. There is no school, no church, no stable home. There is only the road and the next risk. It is the very beginning of Arthur's criminal path, not as a choice, but as the only story he has ever told. Eventually, Lyle Morgan is arrested, tried, and hanged. One day, Arthur has a father who is a bad man. The next day, he has no father at all. The state kills Lyle in the name of order, but it does nothing for the boy left standing under the gallows. No guardians, no inheritance, no guidance. Just a lesson. The law will hang a man, but it will not save his son. In the truest sense, Arthur's alone. From there, the drift begins. Arthur runs with whoever will have him, an angry teenager sleeping in barns, stealing food, lifting horses, and holding up travelers on lonely roads. He is on track to become just another nameless thug, another body in a ditch that civilization will pave over and forget. Yet even then, the contradictions are already there. He can be brutal in a fight, but he lingers near campfires, drawn to laughter and stories. He is smart enough to read people, but cannot read a book. He is already numb to death, but still young enough to be shaped. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and into that gap steps Dutch van der Linde. When Dutch and Hosea find Arthur, half feral and half formed, they do not just see a thief. They see a lost soul who can be molded into the living embodiment of their philosophy. Arthur will not only become their son, he will become Dutch's proof that a broken boy can be remade by an outlaw family. And once Dutch believes that, how far will he go to protect the dream Arthur represents? The first real chapter of Arthur Morgan's life as an outlaw begins in a ditch, in the mud, with a gun in his hand and nowhere to run. The world was changing, The old ways were dying, and a 14-year-old boy was about to be swallowed whole by a civilization that had no patience for poor, angry children who stole to survive. Arthur is mid-crime when Dutch and Hosea cross his path. In some tellings, he is robbing a man on the road. In others, fleeing a botched theft with the law at his heels. The details shift, but the image remains. A lanky kid, half feral and half formed, snarling at two strangers who are, in the truest sense, exactly what he is trying to become. There is a flicker of situational irony here. Three thieves in the same place, each thinking they hold the upper hand. Dutch sees the pistol, the posture, the desperation, and behind it all, he sees potential. Hosea sees something else, a lost soul who will not live out the week if someone does not teach him how the game is really played. Dutch speaks first. He does not talk to Arthur as a child, but as a man. No scolding, no sermon, no hollow threat. Instead, he offers a story of freedom and family, of a world rigged by the rich and powerful, and of men who refuse to bow to it. He takes Arthur's rage and reframes it as principle, his petty crime as early evidence of a larger calling. Why steal for nothing when those same guns and those same hands could be part of something grander? From its humble beginnings, this is how Dutch sells his philosophy. Not as crime, but as resistance. Hosea follows with a different pitch. Where Dutch paints horizons, Hosea talks about nights in jail, men hanged for being careless, and the simple craft of staying alive. He teaches Arthur to read people before reading books, to know when to draw and when to walk away, to pick marks who will not bring a posse down on the entire camp. If Dutch offers dreams, Hosea offers methods. One gives Arthur identity, the other gives him technique. That dual mentorship becomes the spine of Arthur's entire story. Dutch becomes the source of ideas, the living embodiment of an idealistic outlaw code that tells Arthur who he is and what the gang is supposed to stand for. Hosea becomes the quiet counterweight, the man who shows him how to hunt, how to track, how to lie without losing his soul completely. Between them, they build a boy into a weapon and convince him he is a son, and Dutch learns something crucial. As Arthur grows, more disciplined, more loyal, more principled in his own rough way, Dutch holds him up as proof that the philosophy works. If this broken boy can become a righteous outlaw under Dutch's guidance, then the dream must be right, must be real, must be worth any cost. That is the validation loop that will haunt them all, because once Arthur becomes Dutch's proof, what happens when reality starts to contradict the story? Those questions will not be answered for decades, but the seed is planted here, at the very beginning. A rescued thief, a claimed son, and a gang that believes its own legend long before the bullets start flying. That legend hardens in Arthur's teenage years, when the rescued thief becomes the favored gun. From its humble beginnings as a ragged camp of tents and bedrolls, the gang becomes his entire world, and Dutch becomes more than a boss. He becomes the horizon Arthur orients himself toward. Those early years are a story of training, praise, and carefully managed affection. Arthur learns to ride in all weather, pushed to keep pace with Dutch's long strides and Hosea's quiet competence. He learns to shoot not as a butcher, but as an artisan. One clean shot, one clear message. He learns to rob trains and coaches with an almost theatrical flair, Dutch turning every holdup into a speech about freedom, civilization, and how the old ways were dying under the boot of the state. Each successful score ends the same way. Dutch's hand on his shoulder, that low, proud voice. That's my boy. In the truest sense, Dutch discovers that son is the sharpest weapon he owns. He calls Arthur his boy in front of the others, trusts him with the first watch, the last ride, the most dangerous errands. When a job needs a decoy, Arthur rides. When a contact needs intimidating, Arthur goes. Dutch frames this as honor, the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy, the man who does the hard thing so others do not have to. Affection becomes armor, and armor becomes a leash. Arthur, still half a child, absorbs every word. He is not just working for Dutch. He believes he is proof that Dutch's way can take a lost soul and turn him into something better than the hypocrites in their fine suits. When Dutch rails against banks, railroads, and government men, Arthur hears a father defending his family against a hostile civilization. When Hosea raises an eyebrow at some new scheme, Arthur often steps in, defending Dutch with a loyalty that is almost reflex. That loyalty leaves marks long before bullets ever do. When a robbery goes wrong, Arthur takes the blame to keep Pinkertons from sniffing around Dutch. When brutal work is needed, beating information out of someone, cleaning up a corpse, burning a trail behind them, Arthur volunteers, or thinks he does. Each compromise is a small funeral for some part of himself. How many times can a man die inside for another before there is nothing left to bury? By the time the gang settles into its rhythm, Arthur is Dutch's shadow, his enforcer, his conscience on a short chain. But this bond, powerful as it is, will not remain unique. Dutch's dream demands more believers, more sons, more proof. And soon, another boy will ride into their lives, a runaway outlaw named John Marston, whose place in Dutch's heart will turn that dream into a fault line and turn Arthur's quiet devotion into something far more dangerous. John Marston does not enter this story as a hero, or even as a loyal son. He enters as hunger, as proof that the dream Dutch is building will have to contend not just with innocence, but with a boy who has already watched the world tear itself apart. From the very beginning, John's life is a story of absence and neglect. Born to a Scottish immigrant father drifting through America and a prostitute mother who died when he was still a child, John never really had a home. His father drank himself toward the grave, mumbling half-remembered tales of the old country, while the boy learned that promises were as fragile as glass. When the old man finally died, civilization did not catch John. It swallowed him. He was thrown into the orphanage system of the late 19th century, those grim warehouses where unwanted children were stacked and forgotten. There, beatings replaced guidance, and sermons replaced love. The lesson was simple and brutal. Trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. In the truest sense, the institution taught him that freedom was not a right, but something stolen in the dark by those willing to claw for it. John ran. He slipped out between walls and rules, choosing the road over the cage. What followed was not romance, but starvation. He survived through petty theft and quick violence, robbing travelers who were often barely better off than he was. It is almost a cruel joke of fate that when Dutch finally meets John, it is during an attempted robbery, two outlaws both reaching for the same purse and the same gun. One sees a mark, the other sees a mirror. To Dutch, this half-starved teenager is another lost soul to save, another chance to prove that his philosophy can turn broken boys into the living embodiment of resistance. He recognizes in John the same raw potential he once saw in Arthur: courage, intelligence, an instinct for survival. But there is something else as well, something Arthur never had at that age, a deep, cold cynicism, born from institutions and alleys that taught John the world was changing and the old ways were dying, without ever making room for him. Dutch repeats his favorite miracle. He offers John not just food and shelter, but a story. That he is no mere thief, but a soldier in a noble war against a corrupt world. The gang becomes his family, the campfire their fragile civilization, each robbery framed as righteous defiance instead of simple crime. Who would not want to believe that? Arthur does. Arthur leans into belief and gratitude, giving Dutch his loyalty almost without condition. John does not. Even as he rides with the gang, even as he laughs and bleeds beside them, a part of him stays coiled, watching. He has been abandoned by fathers and systems before. He will follow Dutch. He will fight for Dutch. But some quiet part of him never stops asking a dangerous question. What happens when this father fails too? That question will haunt everything that comes next. That question does not just haunt John. It divides the camp long before anyone can name the fracture. From the very beginning, Dutch has an answer ready in the form of Arthur Morgan. Arthur is the established son, the one raised in the gang's shadow, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. Dutch taught him to read, to argue, to believe that their crimes are rebellion and that their family's sacred. Arthur takes those lessons as scripture. When Dutch speaks around the fire, Arthur does not just listen. He absorbs, repeats, enforces. John Marston walks into that world as an interruption. He is younger, sharper at the edges, a boy who has already seen how fathers disappear and promises rot. From its humble beginnings, his relationship with Dutch is not worship but negotiation. John rides along, pulls his weight, laughs with the others, yet when Dutch launches into another speech about freedom and civilization, John's eyes drift, his jaw tightens. He hears the poetry, but he also hears the gaps. The contrast between them becomes a story of two futures competing in the same campfire light. Arthur's eager to please, volunteering for the hardest jobs, repeating Dutch's words about loyalty and destiny as if they are his own. John pushes boundaries, shows up late, questions the wisdom of certain plans, and tests how far this supposed family will bend before it breaks. When Dutch calls a risky job necessary for the dream, Arthur nods. John asks, out loud or under his breath, necessary for who? Dutch, consciously or not, plays them off one another. In front of John, he praises Arthur's loyalty, his steadiness, his refusal to doubt. In front of Arthur, he praises John's independence, his fire, his refusal to bow to civilization. It is a neat trick for a leader who thrives on being needed from both directions, but it plants a quiet rivalry. Two sons, each told he is special for being exactly what the other is not. Over time, that difference hardens into judgment. Arthur sees John's skepticism as ingratitude, a failure to appreciate the man who dragged them out of the gutter and gave them a family in the truest sense. John sees Arthur's devotion as naivety, even delusion, a refusal to admit that the world was changing while Dutch clings to old speeches and older grudges. Arthur believes they owe Dutch everything. John wonders what Dutch actually owes them in return. Those questions will not stay theoretical. As the gang moves from camp to camp, as the old ways were dying and Dutch's plans grow stranger, Arthur and John will respond in opposite ways to each new failure. One will double down, one will pull away. And when the bullets finally start cashing the debts of Dutch's dream, that difference will decide who dies for Dutch, who survives Dutch, and who keeps carrying Dutch's ghost into the next story. So before the flight through Coulter and Rhodes and St. Denis, there was a different life. The gang at its height, a moving utopia of wagons, canvas, and campfire smoke rolling across the frontier. A story of freedom and family, of shared spoils and shared songs, of people who believed they had outsmarted civilization itself. In those years, the Van der Linde gang was not just a crew of robbers. It was the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, a traveling village of thieves, lovers, and children that shifted from the pines of the Grizzlies to river islands and dusty plains. Tents rose beneath mountain shadows, washing lines stretched between trees, and at night, the lanterns made every clearing feel like a secret town that existed only for them. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but in these pockets of wilderness, Dutch told them they were keeping something pure alive. Their work fed the dream. Trains were scoped for weeks, Hosea riding ahead to learn schedules and guards, Dutch pacing the firelight and turning logistics into poetry. Stagecoaches were taken on lonely roads, with Arthur and Bill riding flank and Javier's rifle waiting on a ridge. There were elaborate cons where Hosea pretended to be a respectable businessman or a feeble old man, only for Dutch to arrive as the outraged partner, both men robbing a mark who never quite understood what had happened. Every haul ended the same way. Dutch standing by the money chest, promising that this was one more step toward a life where no one could tell them how to live. From its humble beginnings, that promise pulled in new faces who would one day die for Dutch. Mac Callender came first, a hot-headed young outlaw who mistook Dutch's speeches for scripture and Arthur's approval for knighthood. His brother Davy followed, quieter, more cautious, but unable to imagine a world where Mac rode without him. Jenny Kirk, a runaway drifting between mining towns, found the camp when she was half starved and half ready to give up. Susan put a bowl in her hands. Dutch put a philosophy in her head. In the truest sense, each one was a lost soul given a role, a story, and a family name. Van der Linde. With every successful job, their confidence swelled. They robbed rail barons and stage lines, fleeced oilmen and gamblers, and each escape seemed to prove Dutch right. The law was slow, the rich were soft, and the gang was smarter than both. Pinkertons were a rumor, civilization a distant storm. Around the fires, Dutch spoke of Tahiti, of a land beyond the reach of banks and bullets, and no one asked how a man who could not stay in one state would suddenly settle on an island. Why question a dream that kept paying out? Then the pattern shatters. Cut from a warm camp where Jenny laughs at a bad joke and Davy cleans his revolver, to a different image. A blood-stained cliffside above Blackwater, wind howling over scattered bodies. The first great rupture where Dutch's dream finally demands a real, permanent price. That cliff above Blackwater is more than a crime scene. It is a border. On one side stands Dutch's dream of freedom. On the other marches a new America that has already decided that dream must die. Because while the gang hides in the snow and bleeds in the mud, the world was changing. Railroads laced the continent together, steel veins carrying coal, cattle, and capital from coast to coast. Telegraph wires whisper news faster than any horse can ride. Industrial cities rise in smoke and brick, the living embodiment of a civilization that no longer needs men who live by a gun and a stolen horse. The wilderness the gang depends on is shrinking, fenced and measured, bought and sold. From its humble beginnings as a band of drifting outlaws, the Van der Linde gang had relied on distance and disconnection. Rob a bank in one state, vanish into another. Hit a train where the law is slow and the tracks run through nowhere. But by 1899, there is no true nowhere. A telegram can cross 3 territories in the time it takes Arthur to saddle a horse. A rail line can deliver deputy marshals to a frontier town overnight. The old ways were dying, quietly at first, then all at once. Into that tightening net steps a new kind of enemy. Not a rival gang, not a vengeful rancher, but an institution. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency arrives as the pointed edge of this modern world, armed not only with rifles, but with records, informants, and federal contracts. Milton and Ross do not care about honor or codes. They care about results, about turning Dutch's philosophy into a case file. They follow the gang across state lines because borders no longer protect outlaws when the railroad ignores them. Banks, trains, and towns harden in response. Safes grow thicker, guards more numerous, rewards higher. The St. Denis Bank is not a sleepy frontier vault. It is a fortress wired into the rest of the country, its ledgers and telegraphs ensuring that any disturbance echoes far beyond one city block. Even backwater depots get Pinkerton circulars and wanted posters. Every robbery now sends ripples through a connected world that remembers, records, and retaliates. Yet Dutch refuses to see it. In the truest sense, he becomes the last believer in his own legend. He insists that nothing essential has changed, that civilization is just another bully to be outwitted. One last train, one last bank, one last big score. The refrain becomes a prayer against the encroaching rails and wires. To question it is to betray the family, to admit that the story he has told from the very beginning no longer fits the world around them. And so every member who dies for Dutch is not only dying for a man, but for a past that no longer exists. Each body on a cliffside or a city street is a lost soul sacrificed to a dream progress has already condemned. The tragedy is not just that they fall, but that the world has moved on before they ever hit the ground. The next time Dutch promises that one last job will fix everything, the question is no longer whether the plan will work, but how many more graves that promise will require. That promise had to start somewhere. Before St. Denis, before Guarma, before Beaver Hollow, there was Blackwater, the original sin the game never fully shows, but whose shadow falls over every campfire that follows. On paper, it was simple. A ferry job in a growing town on the edge of civilization, a last great robbery before the world closed in. Dutch sold it as the big score, the one that would finally buy freedom, land, and safety for the entire family. Hosea, ever cautious, questioned the wisdom of robbing a boat in a place crawling with law, but Dutch's philosophy had hardened. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and he refused to fade quietly into someone else's order. From its humble beginnings, the gang had robbed stagecoaches and banks, but this was different. Blackwater was modern, prosperous, the living embodiment of the new America pressing in on the outlaw dream. Dutch convinced himself that striking there was not just profitable, but symbolic, a story of defiance against a civilization that branded them obsolete. Hosea saw risk. Dutch saw destiny. Then, off-screen, everything went wrong. The ferry was more heavily guarded than expected. Pinkertons were waiting, or arrived almost immediately, backed by local law and hired guns. What was meant to be a quick surgical robbery turned into chaos on the docks. Gunfire in the dark, civilians screaming, the gang scattered between the boat and the shoreline with bags of money and no clear escape. In the confusion, Dutch grabbed a young woman as a shield. When the law pressed in, he made a choice that shattered the illusion of his code. He shot her. Not in the heat of a duel, not as a tragic accident, but as a deliberate act to clear a path. That moment is never fully seen, yet it hangs over every conversation that follows. The idealistic leader who once spoke of rules and honor had crossed a line in the truest sense, and everyone who heard about it had to decide what that meant. Was this still a family, or had they become something uglier without admitting it? The cost was immediate. Davy Callender was mortally wounded and abandoned to die in the snow soon after. His brother Mac was left behind in Blackwater, hunted down and executed off-screen. Jenny Kirk, one of the earliest members, never made it out of the escape. She fell somewhere between the docks and the mountains, another lost soul buried in a job the player never witnesses. These unseen bodies are the first clear corpses stacked directly under Dutch's dream. They trusted his rhetoric about one last score, one final act that would buy them a place beyond the reach of civilization, and they paid with their lives, off camera, without even the dignity of a heroic last stand. As the survivors ride north into the blizzard, half-starved, frozen, and hunted, Dutch's dream is already bleeding out in the snow. He will not admit it. He cannot. And before he finally faces what began on that ferry in Blackwater, more loyal men and women will follow Davy, Mac, and Jenny into the dark. The ride into the Grizzlies is not a triumphant escape. It is a funeral procession that refuses to admit it is one. Snow closet faces, wind tears the words out of mouths, and every hoofbeat feels heavier than the last, as if the mountains themselves are trying to drag the gang down and bury Dutch's dream beside Davy in the drifts. Up at Coulter, survival becomes the only philosophy that matters. The cabins are half rotten and half frozen, the firewood damp, the food nearly gone. Men cough in their bedrolls, women wrap blankets around shivering children, and the horses stand with their heads low, ribs showing under wet coats. This is the living embodiment of a story of freedom colliding with the reality of winter and failure. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in that cramped, dim light, those grand speeches about civilization and rebellion suddenly feel very far away. Arthur moves through this world as Dutch's right hand and silent witness. He hauls carcasses, checks on the wounded, rides out into white nothing to search for the missing. Davy dies, gasping in the snow, bleeding into Arthur's hands before there is even time to say a proper goodbye. Jenny never makes it out of Blackwater. Mac is simply gone, swallowed by distance and rumor. For a man raised in this gang from its humble beginnings, that absence is louder than the storm. How many names can disappear before the dream itself begins to feel hollow? Yet Arthur's loyalty holds, at least on the surface. Dutch and Hosea took in a lost soul and made him family. That history does not vanish in a single disaster. When Dutch says, "Trust me," Arthur does. But trust does not stop the questions forming in the back of his mind. Questions that grow colder every time Dutch dodges the truth. What really happened on that ferry? Why were the Pinkertons waiting? Why are the dead piling up while the man who led them there refuses to look back? Dutch's answer is not reflection. It is defiance. Around the campfire, breath steaming in the air, he blames the Pinkertons, the government, the march of civilization, anything and everything except his own choices. He insists they will rebuild, that this is only a setback, that Davy and Jenny died free, and that Mac is surely out there fighting the good fight. In the truest sense, he doubles down on the story rather than the reality. The dream cannot be wrong, only the world can. Some listen with shining eyes, clinging to those words because the alternative is unbearable. Others, Arthur among them, listen in silence. The speeches still move them, but now they carry a new weight. The knowledge that Dutch's plans are not just daring, but lethal. This is the moment when faith begins to hairline crack, even if no one dares name it betrayal. Then, a cut. The snowbound camp, the howling wind, the flicker of dying fires, gone. In their place, a warm, crowded saloon in Valentine, lamps glowing, piano jangling, glasses clinking, mud instead of snow on the floor. The gang will survive the winter. Dutch's dream will ride again into a softer world of whiskey and card tables. But the ghosts of Blackwater are coming with them, unseen at their shoulders, shaping every decision still to come. The saloon in Valentine feels almost safe. Warm light, easy money, cheap whiskey. For a moment, the gang can pretend the ghosts of Blackwater are just bad dreams. But new faces are already stepping into those shadows, ready to bleed for Dutch's philosophy without yet understanding its cost. Sean Maguire is the loudest of them. A brash Irish outlaw with a mouth that runs faster than his gun, he swaggers through campfires and barrooms as if the whole world is a stage built just for him. Captured before the gang reaches Horseshoe Overlook and then dramatically rescued, he turns his own kidnapping into a running joke, a story of how even Cornwall's men could not keep a Maguire down. Under the noise and bravado, though, lies a simple truth. Dutch is the first man who ever treated him as more than a disposable thief. For Sean, the Vanderlinde gang is not just a crew, it is family in the truest sense. Dutch is half father, half legendary chieftain, the living embodiment of every tale Sean heard about rebels and freedom fighters back in Ireland. Dutch indulges his antics, laughs at his stories, and holds him up as proof that their way of life can still attract the young and fearless. To Dutch, Sean's recklessness is not a warning sign. It is a badge of honor. Lenny Summers stands in sharp contrast. Where Sean is noise, Lenny is thought. One of the most educated members of the gang, he reads voraciously, speaks multiple languages, and carries a quiet, simmering anger at a civilization that murdered his father for daring to resist. Dutch's talk of freedom, of throwing off the chains of a rigged world, gives that anger direction. It promises that his pain is not random, but part of a larger struggle. Around the campfire, Dutch points to Sean and Lenny as proof that his dream still lives. Look at them. Young, idealistic, loyal. From its humble beginnings with Arthur and John to this new generation, the gang appears to be a story of renewal, not decay. If boys who can read the future in books and boys who only know the gun both choose the outlaw trail under Dutch's banner, then surely the old ways were not dying. Surely the world was changing in their favor, not against them. Arthur feels that pull as well. To him, Sean and Lenny are little brothers, rough around the edges but worth protecting. He drinks with Sean and Valentine, stumbles through that chaotic, drunken night where identities blur and laughter drowns out the past. He rides with Lenny on quiet jobs, hears him speak thoughtfully about justice, about what freedom might mean beyond robbery and revenge. In those moments, Arthur glimpses what the gang might have been if Dutch's dreams had not curdled into delusions. Their loyalty deepens Arthur's own conflict. How can he abandon Dutch when boys who still believe are standing beside him? How can he ignore the philosophy that gave Lenny a purpose and gave Sean a family? Yet the same devotion that makes them inspiring makes their fate inevitable. Dutch will use their faith as evidence that he is right, even as the world closes in and civilization sharpens its teeth. Both Sean and Lenny will die for that refusal. Sean will fall first, cut down in an ambush Dutch should have anticipated. Lenny will follow in the smoke of St. Denis, lost in a maze Dutch insisted they could beat. Their graves will not just mark two more bodies on the trail. They will mark the point of no return, the moment Dutch's dream stops being a banner and becomes a curse no one can outrun. For a moment, the curse seems to lift. After the frozen misery of Coulter and the hungry uncertainty of Horseshoe Overlook, the Valentine era feels almost like a second beginning, as if the gang has stepped back into an earlier chapter of its own story, and found the pages unwritten again. Around the muddy streets and red buildings of Valentine, the Van der Linde gang rediscovers something close to normal life. There is more food on the tables, more coin in the donation box, more laughter around the campfire. Jobs come steadily. Coach holdups on dusty roads, small-town bank jobs, rescues that end with bruises and jokes instead of funerals. Dutch walks through camp in the truest sense as the old charismatic leader again, coat flaring, voice smooth, philosophy polished until it sounds almost idealistic once more. There are nights when the gang spills into the saloon, turning bar fights into something nearly theatrical. Arthur and Lenny vanish into a haze of whiskey and bad decisions, two outlaws briefly forgetting that the world was changing beyond those swinging doors. Charles brings in game that feeds everyone. Javier plays music. For a little while, it feels as if the family has outrun Blackwater, outrun Cornwall, outrun the very beginning of its own downfall. Yet beneath the laughter, the fractures are already there. John is often absent, riding off on his own, simmering with resentment over how Dutch treated him after Blackwater. When he returns, there are sharp words, questions about loyalty that cut deeper because they are spoken in front of the others. Is John still Dutch's prodigal son, or already a problem to be managed? Arthur watches, saying little, carrying the memory of the ferry disaster, of Jenny and Davy and Mac, the invisible dead who never get mentioned when Dutch boasts about the gang's future. Hosea feels it too. The old conman, who once believed this was a story of clever robberies and careful escapes, sees Dutch's appetite shifting. The jobs are getting bigger, the risks heavier, the talk grander. He urges caution, proposes quieter scores, even toys with the thought of leaving this life behind for good. But the old ways were dying, and Dutch will not let them go. Instead, Dutch brushes every concern aside with speeches about destiny and freedom, about civilization closing in and family needing to stand together or fall alone. He turns shared trauma into fuel, reminding them of the Pinkertons, of Blackwater, of every betrayal they have survived. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Caution becomes cowardice. Under that pressure, even Hosea steps back, hoping Dutch will steady himself once the gang is truly safe. But safety is never the goal. Glory is. As the camp prepares to move on toward Rhodes, toward the Braithwaite, Grey feud, Dutch sees not a warning but a stage. New families to play against each other, new fortunes to seize, new chances to prove his philosophy to a world that refuses to listen. The Valentine days will be remembered as the last time the gang could pretend it was whole. In Rhodes, the pretending will end, and the body count will begin to rise for real. Rhodes is where Dutch stops running from disaster and starts trying to conduct it. To him, the Braithwaite, Grey feud is not a warning from the very beginning, but an invitation. Two proud, decaying dynasties, clinging to the old ways while the world was changing around them. To a man who has always raged against civilization and its hypocrisies, they are the living embodiment of everything he claims to hate, and everything he believes he can exploit. On paper, it is perfect. The Greys control the law. The Braithwaites control the land. Both control money they did not earn and power they no longer deserve. Dutch sees a story of arrogance and rot, of families that once owned the world and now can barely hold on to their own fences. If he can bleed both sides, play the gentleman outlaw among southern ruins, he can fund the gang's escape and humiliate a social order he has always called a lie. At least, that is the philosophy he sells around the campfire. In practice, Rhodes becomes a chessboard. Dutch moves men and women as pieces, not people, drifting between Braithwaite Manor and the Grey Plantation with a smile that grows a little too confident each time. He relishes the irony of drinking with sheriffs he plans to rob and flattering planters he intends to ruin. Hosea, watching from the porch with those tired, knowing eyes, feels the ground shifting. He warns Dutch that this is not a simple con, that the old ways were dying here in blood, not in speeches, and that stepping between these houses is stepping into a graveyard. Dutch hears him. Dutch ignores him. The thrill is too strong. For a man who once robbed trains for food, from its humble beginnings in backwater towns, the chance to outwit old money and the law in one stroke is intoxicating. Ambushes on country roads, strange silences in Braithwaite halls, the way the Greys look at the gang with a hatred they barely bother to hide, each is brushed aside as the cost of doing business. He has beaten worse enemies before, he insists. He will beat these. And the younger ones believe him. Sean Maguire, loud and laughing, treats Rhodes as another adventure, another chapter in the dream of freedom Dutch has promised since the first campfire. Lenny Summers, sharp and educated, trusts that this is strategy, not recklessness, that the man who quotes philosophy and preaches loyalty would not gamble their lives on a whim. To them, Dutch is still the general who cannot lose. Cut. The noise of the camps and the grand speeches falls away. A quiet, sunlit road winds through Lemoyne, dust drifting in the heat, birds cutting lazy circles above the fields. Sean rides at the front, joking, relaxed, unaware that rifles are already trained on his chest. In this still moment, all of Dutch's calculations, all of his boasts about outsmarting families and lawmen, collapse into a single trigger pull that will prove him very, very wrong. The shot ends him before the joke on his lips can even turn into sound. 1 second, Sean Maguire is the loudest man on the road. The next, he is falling out of the saddle, half his head gone, Dutch's dream bleeding into the dirt beside him. To understand how brutal that moment is, the story has to go back years, across an ocean, to a boy raised in an Ireland already crushed under empire. Sean grows up in a world where rebellion is a family trade. His father hanged, his uncles imprisoned, his own name whispered around barracks and gallows. Arrests, interrogations, near executions, these are not legends to him, but memories. He survives botched robberies, failed uprisings, and more than one escape that should have been impossible. From its humble beginnings, his life is a story of constant flight, of a young outlaw who keeps slipping the noose through sheer audacity. By the time he falls in with the Van der Linde gang, Sean is already, in the truest sense, a veteran. Dutch and Hosea do not find a scared boy. They find a man who has stared down rifles and laughed. Around the campfire, he becomes comic relief, the one who turns fear into stories and danger into punchlines. In a world of brooding men and haunted pasts, he is the living embodiment of reckless joy. Yet under the noise sits something deadly serious: loyalty. Sean believes Dutch when he talks about freedom from civilization, about a philosophy that turns robbery into resistance. If Dutch needs a distraction, a scout, a man to walk into the lion's den, Sean volunteers, every time. That is what makes the ride into Rhodes so cruel. On the surface, it is routine, a simple return after a hostage exchange, the gang rolling in relaxed, almost triumphant. But the world was changing. Cornwall's men are in the region, the Braithwaites and Greys are playing their quiet war, and law and capital are learning to be patient. Warnings reach Dutch about Cornwall's agents, about Pinkerton's tightening the net, about how the old ways were dying. Dutch waves them off. He insists on a public entrance, on swagger over subtlety, as if bravado alone can hold back modern rifles. Sean rides at the front because Dutch's way has always worked before. Why doubt it now? The sniper's bullet answers that question with terrible finality. There is no duel, no standoff, no chance for a fearless fighter to prove himself. Just a hidden gunman, a distant scope, and a body in the street. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, condensed into a single crack of gunfire. Sean dies for Dutch in the most literal way possible, placed in harm's way by a leader who refuses to adapt, and killed because he trusts that leader's confidence more than his own survival instincts. His death marks a pivot point, a quiet announcement that the gang's enemies are now organized, disciplined, and invisible, while Dutch is still acting as if charisma can outdraw a telescope sight. From this moment on, every ride into town carries Sean's ghost beside it, and every new plan exposes how badly Dutch has misread the changing world. Sean's death hits the camp like a shot that never stops echoing. 1 second he is laughing on the wagon, the living embodiment of the gang's reckless confidence, and the next he is face down in the mud with half his skull gone. The casual brutality of it, the way the shooter never even shows his face, sends a colder message than any speech from Dutch or Cornwall ever could. Around the fire, the reaction is stunned and uneven. Karen drinks until her hands stop shaking. Bill paces, cursing roads, cursing the Greys, cursing the whole world, but never quite daring to curse Dutch. Tilly and Mary Beth move in quiet circles, tending to the women, trying to keep the camp from splintering. Even hardened outlaws who faced the blizzard at Coulter and the bullets at Blackwater look smaller now, glancing toward the tree line as if another invisible rifle might already be trained on them. If someone as tough and lucky as Sean can be erased in an instant, what does that say about the rest of them? Arthur feels it deeper than most. To him, Sean's death is not just another body. It is a crack running straight through the story Dutch has been telling since the very beginning. Anger comes first, hot and directionless, because there is no duel, no chance to draw, no grandstand. Just a boy gunned down in a town he was told was safe enough for a celebration. Then comes the guilt. Arthur was there. Arthur was supposed to see trouble coming. A man raised from its humble beginnings on Dutch's promise that he always has a plan now watches that promise bleed out on the street. In that moment, Arthur starts to notice the gap between Dutch's philosophy and the reality closing in around them. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and yet Dutch still talks as if charm and fire can bend civilization out of the way. Sean's grave becomes, in Arthur's mind, a question mark carved into the earth. How many more are going to be planted to keep this dream alive? Dutch, however, refuses the question. At the funeral, he steps forward, voice steady, coat immaculate, every inch the prophet of freedom addressing his weary flock. He speaks of sacrifice, of the price of their ideals, of enemies in fine suits who fear men who will not bow. He calls Sean a martyr in the truest sense, a brave son of the gang who died so the rest might live free. He promises revenge, promises that roads will burn, that the Greys and Braithwaites will pay, that Sean's blood will buy them a future. What he does not mention is miscalculation. He does not admit that he led them into a feud he barely understood, that his need to prove himself smarter than every rich family in the South put Sean in that street. By turning the boy's death into a rallying cry, Dutch performs a quiet act of betrayal. Sean's grave becomes a receipt, proof that Dutch's words can spend lives as easily as they spend bullets, and that every loss will be repackaged as fuel to push the gang harder into danger. Some listen and feel comforted. Others listen and feel a chill. Arthur stands near the back, watching Dutch's eyes, hearing the rhythm more than the meaning, realizing that grief in this camp is never allowed to be just grief. It must always be turned into momentum. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is being written right under their boots, and each mound of fresh dirt is another signature. If a loud, reckless survivor like Sean can vanish between one joke and the next, rattling the camp to its core, what will happen when Dutch points that same righteous fury at St. Denis and leads one of the gang's brightest minds, Lenny Summers, into a slaughter he personally designs? Lenny Summers walks into the story already marked by the world's cruelty, a young black man in a country that has outlawed his freedom on paper and in practice. Before he ever hears Dutch speak about civilization and corruption, he watches his own father dragged from a home and lynched by racists who will never see a jail cell. That is the very beginning for Lenny. A noose, a mob, and a system that calls itself lawful while it murders his family. From that night on, Lenny's life is a story of rage looking for a direction. He runs, he steals, he survives, but he refuses to let his mind rot. He teaches himself, reads whatever he can get his hands on, and becomes one of the most educated people in the gang long before he is officially one of them. He speaks multiple languages, pores over books, and thinks in terms of ideas and systems, not just bullets and coin. In a world where the old ways were dying and new forms of oppression were rising, Lenny wants more than revenge. He wants meaning. So when Dutch von der Linde finds him, hunted and alone, the meeting feels inevitable. Dutch's philosophy about freedom, about fighting the corruption of civilization, is exactly the language Lenny has been waiting to hear. Dutch rails against the same system that killed Lenny's father. He quotes books, talks about history, paints their outlaw life as resistance instead of mere crime. For a sharp, idealistic mind, this is not just a gang leader. This is a teacher. In the truest sense, Dutch becomes the living embodiment of every book Lenny ever loved. Inside the camp, Lenny quickly proves he is more than a student. He is a quick thinker in robberies, a calm voice in planning, and a deadly accurate shot when the guns come out. To him, the van der Linde gang is not only family, it is a vehicle for justice, a way to strike back at the racist, oppressive structures that tore his life apart. When he rides into Rhodes, into St. Denis, into battle after battle, he does not see himself as a bandit chasing coin. He sees himself as part of a cause. That is why his bond with Arthur Morgan matters so much. Arthur, the aging enforcer, and Lenny, the brilliant young believer, share moments that cut through the gang's grand speeches. Their drunken night in Valentine, stumbling through the saloon, losing each other in a haze of laughter and mistaken identities, is funny on the surface and heartbreaking underneath. Two men who have killed and bled for Dutch end up wrestling in mud and hugging strangers, briefly tasting a world where they are just friends, not soldiers. How many futures are buried in that hangover? All of it leads towards St. Denis. Dutch promises that this glittering city, this symbol of modern civilization, will be where the gang finally scores enough to buy true freedom. For Lenny, who has believed every word, the bank job is supposed to be the proof that the philosophy was real. Instead, Dutch's grand design collapses into chaos. Hosea is executed, Pinkertons swarm, and in the smoke and screaming, Lenny Summers, the scholar outlaw, is cut down on a rooftop as he tries to escape the slaughter Dutch insisted on. His reward for loyalty is not justice, not redemption, not even a chance to grow old. It is a bullet, and a body left behind in a city that never knew his name. And as the survivors scatter into the night, Dutch's dream has claimed another true believer, clearing the stage for the next doomed promise. St. Denis is where Dutch van der Linde finally steps onto the kind of stage he always imagined he deserved. A city of smoke and steel, of clanging trolleys and electric lights. It is the living embodiment of everything he claims to despise about civilization, and yet the place he chooses for his grandest performance. The world was changing. The old ways were dying, not out on some lonely plain, but in these choking streets where factories belched progress into the sky and men in suits made fortunes, without ever touching a gun. To Dutch, St. Denis is not just a city, it is an insult. Every brick, every billboard, every telephone wire seems to mock his philosophy of freedom, his belief that the outlaw can still carve out a place beyond the reach of the state. So the bank at the heart of St. Denis becomes an obsession. Dutch convinces himself that robbing it is more than a job. It is a statement, a story of rebellion in the truest sense, a final, defiant gesture that will prove his ideas were right all along. One last score, he promises, and the gang will sail away to Tahiti, to some distant shore where the law cannot follow and the dream can begin again from its humble beginnings. Hosea sees through it. The old conman suggests safer paths, smaller robberies, spreading the risk, even the unthinkable notion of negotiating some kind of truce, disappearing quietly before the noose tightens. He speaks of family, of survival, of knowing when the game is over. But his voice is fading in Dutch's counsel. Micah leans in instead, hissing poison dressed as courage, urging Dutch to go big or go home, to prove that the gang is not beaten, only cornered. By the time the plan is laid out, there is a terrible sense of inevitability. The gang is tired, hunted, and broke, driven from camp to camp since Blackwater. Every road seems to lead to a noose or a bullet. Against that backdrop, Dutch's promise of a single, life-changing payday feels less like madness and more like the only door left open. Who would not follow the man who has always found a way out before? Dutch spreads blueprints across a table, his voice smooth, confident, almost hypnotic as he points out escape routes and timing, every detail supposedly accounted for. Cut. Hosea Matthews walks through the bank's front doors as a supposed hostage, shoulders slightly stooped, hat low, playing the role he has played his entire life. A harmless old man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He does not know he is walking into his own execution, that his biggest stage will also be the trap that finally snaps shut on the gang's beating heart. And once Hosea falls, the dream he helped build will begin to devour the rest. He walks in as a harmless old man. He dies as a message. Inside the St. Denis Bank, Hosea plays his part with the easy grace of a man who has spent a lifetime turning danger into theater. He shuffles, he frets, he lets the clerks and guards underestimate him. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang has survived on this balance of performance and precision, on Dutch's grand philosophy wrapped around Hosea's careful planning. Even here, in the heart of civilization, Hosea still believes this is just another piece of controlled chaos, another mad dash toward freedom that Dutch will somehow thread into a story of survival. Outside, the world was changing. The old ways were dying, and the Pinkertons were the living embodiment of that new, merciless order. The trap snaps shut without warning. Lawmen swarm the streets, rifles on rooftops, shotguns in alleyways, a ring of iron around the bank. This is not a messy reaction to a robbery gone wrong. It is a staged spectacle, a public execution designed from the very beginning to break more than bodies. When Agent Milton steps forward with Hosea dragged in front of him, the balance of power is laid bare for all to see. Hosea is not behind cover. He is not with a gun in his hand. He is in the open street, held up as an example. Milton does not bargain in good faith. He parades a tired old outlaw who once dreamed of conning bankers, now used as a prop by them. In the truest sense, Hosea has become the hostage he was pretending to be. Dutch, Arthur, and the rest watch from the bank windows and rooftop, helpless, as Milton taunts Dutch's ideals, spits on his talk of family and freedom, and then pulls the trigger. Hosea dies fast. The meaning does not. The bullet that tears through his chest does more than kill a man. It murders Dutch's conscience in front of the gang. This is the partner who argued for smaller scores, who warned against Blackwater, who questioned St. Denis. This is the man who tried to steer Dutch away from delusions and toward survival. When Hosea's body hits the cobblestones, the last real restraint on Dutch's worst impulses hits with it. Dutch does not collapse. He erupts. Instead of seeing his own reflection in that blood, he reaches for rage, for betrayal, for any story but the true one. He blames Milton, the Pinkertons, the city, the entire weight of civilization pressing down on his dream. He does not admit that he walked Hosea into that bank, that he had chances to pull back, that his need to prove his philosophy has now cost him the one man who could still tell him no. Hosea's death is, in the purest sense, a death for Dutch. He is there because he trusts the plan, because decades of loyalty convince him Dutch will find a way out, because he believes their partnership still has one last miracle left. Dutch refuses to yield, and Hosea pays the price that Dutch will never truly acknowledge. From that moment on, Dutch is a leader unmoored, a dreamer without a map, a lost soul convinced the map was wrong all along. And as the gang scrambles into a doomed escape, another believer is already marked to fall beside Hosea's shadow. The escape is not a plan. It is an explosion. Smoke boils out of the bank doors, gunfire snaps through the St. Denis streets, and the Van der Linde gang is hurled into motion by pure terror rather than strategy. Dutch shouts to keep moving, to get to the rooftops, to trust that there is a way out. But there is no map anymore. Only noise, fear, and blind faith. They scatter through alleys choked with civilians and lawmen, boots hammering on cobblestones slick with rain and blood. Arthur, Lenny, John, Bill, Javier, they climb fire escapes and crash through windows, cutting across the upper bones of the city. This is the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy gone wrong. Not freedom from civilization, but being hunted by it from every angle. The old ways were dying, and Dutch had chosen to prove it by picking a fight with the beating heart of modern power. On the rooftops, the world narrows to Arthur and Lenny, two outlaws sprinting side by side, trading shots with faceless lawmen, ducking behind chimneys and skylights as bullets chew brick and slate. Lenny moves with a calm, precise confidence. The educated kid who could read French novels now reading firing lines and angles, trusting that Dutch's grand design still stretches beyond the next rooftop. Arthur trusts it too, because from the very beginning, Dutch's voice has been the compass he follows. There is a moment where it almost feels heroic. Two friends covering each other, shouting warnings, laughing breathlessly in the absurdity of surviving one more volley. They are, in the truest sense, the story Dutch always told about family, loyal, brave, united against a hostile world. But that story ends in a single cut. Lenny pops up to return fire, outlined against the smoky St. Denis sky, and the lawmen do what the world was always going to do to Dutch's dream. They cut it down. Shots ring out. Lenny's body jerks, then crumples on the tiles, his blood mixing with the city soot. There is no speech, no farewell, no heroic last stand. Arthur calls his name, but there is only more gunfire, more shouting, more orders to move. He cannot drag the body. He cannot even kneel. He has to run, leaving Lenny's corpse cooling on a rooftop he never meant to die on. Lenny's death is not random. It is the direct invoice for Dutch's overreach, the price of turning St. Denis into a stage for his failing ideology. If Dutch had not insisted that this bank job would prove their philosophy, that they could outsmart the most advanced city in the region, Lenny Summers would almost certainly still be alive, still arguing about books by the campfire, still dreaming of a world where a black man could breathe without a badge on his neck. Instead, one of the gang's brightest, most hopeful believers dies namelessly in the smoke, swallowed by a city Dutch swore he understood. No grave, no marker, no family beside him. Just another lost soul erased by the collision between dreams and civilization. Every lawman who steps over that body is another reminder that this was never a story of freedom, only a story of delusions meeting brick and steel. Lenny's rooftop becomes another invisible grave in Dutch's long trail of betrayal, another receipt for promises that were never real. And as Arthur runs on, half of him already buried beside Hosea and Lenny, Dutch is already looking for the next miracle that will cost someone else their life. In the smoking aftermath of St. Denis, Dutch's dream does not die with Hosea and Lenny. It mutates. From its humble beginnings as a banner of freedom for the poor and unwanted, it twists into something harsher, colder, and far more dangerous. The philosophy stays the same in words. In deeds, it becomes unrecognizable. At the very beginning, Dutch preached restraint. No women, no children, no killing unless forced. Rob the rich, humiliate the powerful, expose the corruption of a civilization built on exploitation. He told Arthur that their outlaw world was a story of resistance, not cruelty, that they were the living embodiment of a better way. But after St. Denis, that careful balance between idealism and reality collapses. Dutch orders the torture of Angelo Bronte, feeds him to alligators, and calls it justice. He leaves people behind, lies more easily, and starts to see betrayal in every shadow. His language, though, barely changes. Have a little faith. We just need money. One last score and it will all be different. These lines once framed daring but calculated robberies. Now they precede disasters. Guarma, the train ambushes, the doomed assaults around Beaver Hollow, each new plan scatters the gang further, leads to death, capture, or another frantic flight. The words promise salvation. The reality delivers graves. Dutch even begins to weaponize the dead. Hosea is no longer a conscience. He becomes a prop in Dutch's speeches. Hosea died for this. Sean died for this. Lenny died for this. Instead of treating those losses as proof that the old ways were dying and the dream needed to change, Dutch uses them as fuel, demanding more loyalty, more sacrifice, more blind faith. The fallen are recast as martyrs whose blood obligates the survivors to push deeper into the abyss. Arthur feels that shift in the truest sense. For over 20 years, Dutch and Hosea had been his family, his teachers, his compass in a hostile world. Now the compass spins wildly. Arthur watches Dutch walk away from wounded allies, ignore starving women and children, and trust Micah over men who bled for him. The gap between speech and action widens until it becomes a canyon. When Dutch says, "I am trying, Arthur," the words sound hollow, not heroic. Arthur begins to understand that the man he loved might already be gone, replaced by a leader who values the dream more than the people who built it. Then, a break in the noise. Dutch stands before the gang at Beaver Hollow, delivering another impassioned sermon about freedom, loyalty, and destiny. His voice rises, his eyes blaze, his rhetoric soars. Cut. The camp at night. Fewer tents, fewer bedrolls. The fire smaller, the circle around it broken by empty spaces where Hosea, Sean, Lenny, and others once sat. No speeches, no music. Only wind in the trees and the quiet, unspoken question hanging over every flicker of flame. How many more will die for this? And still, somewhere in the dark, Dutch is already planning the next score. In that shrinking circle of firelight, with Dutch already dreaming up the next miracle, another presence is moving closer to the center of the story. Not a grieving friend, not a fallen idealist, a parasite. Micah Bell steps into the vacuum Hosea's death has torn open, and from the very beginning his purpose is simple: feed Dutch's worst self and grow fat on the ruin that follows. Micah is an outlaw in the truest sense, but not in the way Dutch once preached. His past is a trail of burned bridges and shallow graves, a man who drifts from posse to posse, offering a quick gun and abandoning any camp that stops paying or starts asking questions. There is no philosophy, no dream of freedom, only survival and self-interest. When he finds the Vanderlinde gang, he does not see a family. He sees a ladder. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's world was built on the illusion of mutual loyalty. Micah recognizes that illusion instantly and turns it into a weapon. Where Hosea would probe, where Arthur would challenge, Micah flatters. Dutch wants to hear that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, that only bold men are strong enough to resist civilization's chokehold. Micah gives him that over and over. And every reckless plan is genius. Every hesitation from others is doubt and weakness. When Hosea is killed in St. Denis, the gang loses its conscience in a single rifle shot. Into that silence, Micah's voice becomes louder. He urges Dutch toward more aggressive scores, more violent answers. The Cornwall train at Coulter, the bloody rescue of Sean, the bank in St. Denis itself, each time Dutch chooses the loudest, bloodiest suggestion, Micah is there, nodding, praising, insisting that fortune favors the ruthless. Each corpse left behind becomes proof, not of failure, but of how far the gang must now go to justify the losses. He undermines Arthur and John with the same patience a snake uses to coil. When Arthur questions Dutch's cruelty in Strawberry, or the pointless slaughter in the trolley station, Micah reframes it as betrayal. When John wants out for Abigail and Jack, Micah whispers that John is ungrateful, that family must bleed for the cause. Dissent stops being concern and becomes treason. How many men die because the only voice Dutch trusts is the one that tells him he is never wrong? By Beaver Hollow, Micah is the living embodiment of Dutch's paranoia. He spies, he lies, he feeds Dutch half-truths about Pinkertons and rats, all while pushing for one more job, one more massacre, one more chance to cash out and disappear. The tragedy is not merely that Micah is there, poisoning everything. The tragedy is that Dutch chooses the poison. Those who die for Dutch in this final act do not fall to Micah's bullets alone. They fall because Dutch prefers Micah's flattery to Hosea's truth, and that choice will haunt every grave the gang leaves behind. By Beaver Hollow, the poison is not just Micah. The poison is Dutch's reflection, and Arthur is the one forced to watch the man who raised him vanish behind it. The lies grow bolder, the promises thinner, the casualties more personal. Dutch leaves Sean to walk into an ambush, lets Hosea die in St. Denis as a distraction, abandons John on the rooftops, and then dares to call what is left of this wrecked camp a family. For Arthur, who has been there from the very beginning, every broken word cuts deeper than a bullet. This is the man who taught him to read, to question, to believe that the gang was more than a pack of thieves. Dutch once preached a philosophy of freedom against a rigged civilization, claiming they robbed the rich and spared the innocent. Now, that same voice orders massacres in Strawberry, slaughters in the swamps, and a doomed stand in a city that never cared if they lived or died. Arthur's loyalty does not vanish overnight. It erodes, quietly, mission by mission. He rides into Rhodes to rescue Jack, into St. Denis for the bank, into Guarma for Dutch's latest miracle escape, long after he has stopped believing in miracles. Each job becomes a ritual sacrifice, not just of blood but of identity. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is written into his bones as he keeps dying inside for a man he no longer recognizes. So when the coughing starts, the diagnosis does not feel random. Tuberculosis is the physical verdict on a spiritual condition that has been festering for years. Arthur has been breathing in Dutch's smoke, Dutch's rage, Dutch's delusions, until his lungs and his conscience are equally scarred. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in the truest sense Arthur has been dying with them, a loyal outlaw dragged toward a grave dug by someone else's dream. The knowledge of limited time sharpens everything. Faces in camp are no longer just comrades. They are lives on a ledger already soaked in debt. John has a wife and a son. Sadie burns with a focused fury. Charles is the living embodiment of the gang's better nature. Against them stands Dutch, a leader who now abandons his wounded, lies about plans, and listens more to a snake in a gaudy coat than to the son who followed him for 20 years. Who deserves the last of Arthur's strength? Who has earned the right to his final breath? From its humble beginnings, this was supposed to be a family. Now Arthur must decide whether to die protecting Dutch's fantasy or to die protecting John's future. His final choice, between the man who made him and the man who might escape him, will decide not only who walks away from Beaver Hollow, but what Dutch's dream becomes in the world that survives him. Arthur's choice at Beaver Hollow does not appear from nowhere. It is the final link in a chain of deaths that began long before his lungs filled with blood and dust, a story of one man's philosophy grinding down everyone who dared to believe in it. The first domino falls at Blackwater, even if the bodies stay off screen. Jenny, Davy, Mac, names that are barely spoken, faces never seen, are the ghosts that haunt every later campfire. That ferry job is the original sin, the moment Dutch's dream of freedom collides with the machinery of civilization and loses. From that night on, the gang is not expanding, it is bleeding. Dutch's paranoia grows in the silence left by the dead, and each new plan is not a bold step forward, but a frantic attempt to outrun a past that is already catching up. Sean's death at Rhodes is the next crack through the foundation. A loud, fearless young outlaw who treated danger as a joke, shot mid-sentence in the street, drops the camp's morale into the dirt. If Blackwater proved they could lose, Sean proves they can die for nothing. The gang buries a true believer, and in his place rises a colder calculation. Some, like Micah, see an opportunity. Others, like Arthur and Charles, feel the first real chill that Dutch's way of life may no longer fit the world that was changing. Then St. Denis rips out the gang's brain and heart in a single night. Hosea, the strategist who questioned Dutch's excesses from the very beginning, dies as a public spectacle, executed to break their spirit. Lenny, the bright, educated sharpshooter who represented the gang's idealistic future, is cut down on a rooftop while following Dutch's orders. In the truest sense, their deaths remove the last stabilizing forces. What remains around Dutch are either hardened survivors, too numb to walk away, or unstable figures who feed his worst impulses. Grief does not unite them. It curdles into blame. Some quietly fault Dutch, remembering ignored warnings and reckless promises. Others spit curses at the law, Cornwall, or fate itself. Yet beneath every whispered theory runs the same unspoken truth. Dutch's decisions tie every grave together. Every body is another receipt for his dream. The camp reflects this fracture. Each new hideout is smaller, tighter, more desperate. Where there was once one family gathered around a fire, there are now cliques in corners, whispered arguments, and suspicious glances. The living embodiment of Dutch's family of outlaws philosophy dissolves into little courts of loyalty and betrayal, as the old ways were dying inside the camp long before the bullets arrived. And then, with brutal suddenness, the world changes completely. The mud, the pines, the familiar American dust vanish. The camera opens on Guarma. Blinding sun, choking humidity, foreign voices, sugar fields, and revolution. It is a jarring cut, a pattern interrupt that underlines how far this family has fallen. They are no longer fighting for a home. They are stranded at the end of the world, exiles driven there by Dutch's stubbornness. More will die on that island, far from their own graves, proving that the gang's collapse is no longer a possibility. It is already in motion, and there is no way back. Guarma is not just a change of scenery. It is the moment Dutch's dream washes up on a foreign shore and starts to rot in the sun. The gang flees St. Denis in chaos, Hosea and Lenny dead, Pinkertons closing in, Dutch shouting that they will escape by sea. Instead of freedom, a storm tears the ship apart. Men are thrown into black water, and the survivors wake on a beach that might as well be the edge of the world. From its humble beginnings on the American frontier, this outlaw family had always imagined itself as drifting just outside civilization's reach. Now it is stranded in the truest sense, not in some mythic west, but on Guarma, a sugar island ruled by a brutal plantation dynasty and racked by a rebellion Dutch does not understand. The old ways were dying back home. Here, a different empire is cracking, and Dutch seizes on it as proof his philosophy still matters. He should be focused on getting his people home. They are starving, sick, half-drowned, scattered through jungle and cane fields. Instead, he reframes the shipwreck as destiny, when the gang stumbles into the struggle between Colonel Fusar and the local revolutionaries. Dutch declares that this is their fight now, that helping the rebels will give them a ship, a fortune, a way to rebuild. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, played out on someone else's battlefield. There is a grim irony to it. The man who once preached freedom from government and corporations now inserts his shattered gang into a colonial war for sugar profits. He talks about ideals and oppression, but he barely knows the language, the history, or the stakes. What he understands is that if Guarma is a grand cause, then St. Denis was not a failure. If this is revolution, then he is still the living embodiment of resistance, not a leader who got his family killed. The cost is immediate. Javier is captured and tortured, his loyalty repaid with near death in a stone cell. Bill and the others stagger through malaria and exhaustion, their bodies breaking under heat and hunger. Unknown rebels die around them in skirmishes and ambushes, faces the gang never even learns, and men from the ship's crew are cut down in firefights that have nothing to do with Blackwater, St. Denis, or any future the gang might still have had. Every bullet fired on Guarma is a bullet spent on Dutch's ego. Nothing gained there follows them back to America, except scars, fever, and a deeper fracture between Dutch and Arthur. The island adventure does not secure land, money, or safety. It only proves that Dutch will now drag his followers across oceans for a fantasy. Guarma marks the moment his dream fully detaches from practical reality, when this family stops dying for a home and starts dying for a man's pride. And once they finally escape that jungle, the delusion does not stay behind. When the survivors finally wash back onto the mainland, it is not a triumphant return. It is the gang stepping into a world that has quietly decided it no longer needs them. The world was changing while they were roasting under the Guarman sun, and the moment their boots hit the docks, that change becomes impossible to ignore. There are new wanted posters in every town, the ink barely dry but the price is already higher. Dutch's name, Arthur's, John's, Bill's, Javier's, all framed as the living embodiment of everything civilization wants to stamp out. Pinkertons move with more confidence now, patrols thicker on the roads, lawmen less afraid to draw first. Old allies have either disappeared or turned their backs. The Wapiti are scattered and broken, the Braithwaites and Greys are gone, and even the local fences and informants act distant, measuring every word. From its humble beginnings as a roaming band that could slip through the cracks, the Van der Linde gang has become a target too big to ignore. Back in camp, there is no sense of homecoming, only exhaustion. Beaver Hollow is damp, claustrophobic, and infected with more than just disease. The air is heavy with mistrust, with the quiet realization that Dutch's promise of a fresh start, of land, Tahiti, or some other mirage on the horizon, has failed over and over. Every one last score has only dug the grave deeper. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's philosophy, once idealistic and intoxicating, now sounds rehearsed, a speech given to an audience that no longer believes in the script. Some begin to drift in spirit long before they leave in body. Mary Beth watches the camp with writer's eyes, already narrating a different life in her head, a story of trains and cities and quiet anonymity. Tilly weighs her loyalty against the future of the child she hopes to have, knowing that Dutch's war against civilization will not spare mothers. Karen drinks harder. Swanson clings to the Bible with shaking hands. They are not plotting a coup, they are planning an exit. Meanwhile, others cling to Dutch not out of conviction, but habit and fear. Bill needs a leader to tell him who to shoot. Javier, bound by old memories of shared fires and shared blood, refuses to accept that the man who once fought for freedom has become its enemy. In the truest sense, they are prisoners of a past that no longer exists. Into this fractured camp steps Micah, whispering poison. He feeds Dutch a simple, convenient narrative. The real traitors are not the informants or the ghosts of Guarma, but Arthur and John. Every question Arthur asks, every plea John makes to leave with Abigail and Jack, becomes evidence of betrayal. Dutch's paranoia, once a survival instinct, turns outward, a weapon aimed at the very people trying to salvage what remains of this family. So the gang becomes a gang in name only, a cluster of lost souls orbiting a man who has mistaken his ego for destiny. And as the camp splinters into those preparing to run and those ready to die, one looming question hangs over Beaver Hollow. When the final confrontations come, who will still choose to die for Dutch, and who will finally find the strength to walk away? In that fractured camp at Beaver Hollow, the loudest arguments are not the only measure of the gang's collapse. In the shadows of Dutch's grand speeches stand the quieter tragedies, the people whose deaths for Dutch do not come with last stands or famous gunfights, but with fear, confusion, and a terrible sense of being forgotten. Kieran Duffy is the clearest example. From the very beginning, he is not a true Van der Linde outlaw, but an O'Driscoll captive dragged into the world Dutch built. Arthur hauls him back to Coulter as a prisoner, a shivering wreck tied to a post. And for a time, Kieran is little more than a bargaining chip in Dutch's private war with Colum. Yet Kieran keeps trying. He rides with the gang, shares information, risks his life on jobs, and begs for the chance to prove his loyalty to a family that never fully accepts him. His arc is a story of a lost soul trying to belong in a camp that preaches freedom but lives in paranoia. Even when some begin to warm to him, the old ways were dying inside the gang. Trust is scarce, suspicion is cheap, and Dutch's philosophy has narrowed to enemies and assets. Kieran is always closer to the second category than the first. He did not choose the feud with Colum O'Driscoll. He was born into it by bad luck. So when the O'Driscolls strike back, it is Kieran who pays. The gang finds his horse stumbling into camp, his decapitated head lashed to the saddle, eyes blind with terror even in death. His mutilated body follows, dumped as a message. Dutch's long feud, from its humble beginnings in a bar fight and a dead lover, has claimed another life, and this time the victim never even had the comfort of believing in the cause that killed him. How many more will be dragged under by a war they never chose? If Kieran's fate is a brutal echo of the gang's external enemies, Molly O'Shea's death shows the rot within. Once Dutch's lover and muse, she is the living embodiment of his early charm, romantic, idealistic, drawn to a man who promises a different kind of world. But as the dream curdles, Dutch turns away from her, pouring his attention into Micah's flattery and impossible plans. Molly is left drifting at the edge of the firelight, watching the man she loves vanish into his own delusions. Her end is not a blaze of glory. It is a drunken, desperate outburst at camp, a woman screaming that Dutch has failed her, that she betrayed him to the Pinkertons, or perhaps only wishes she had, just to hurt him. Dutch's response is cold distance. Susan Grimshaw's is a gunshot. One moment of chaos, one pull of a trigger, and Molly dies in the mud, condemned more for embarrassing Dutch than for any proven betrayal. Both deaths reveal Dutch's failures in the truest sense. He cannot protect the vulnerable man who trusted him, and he cannot care for the vulnerable woman who loved him. His dream of freedom has become a machine that grinds down the weak first. Not every sacrifice for Dutch happens with rifles raised against a pink dawn. Some happen in the quiet of camp, in a single scream, in a headless horse returning through the trees. And as the gang stares at Kieran's corpse and Molly's body, another truth settles over Beaver Hollow. The final reckoning will not only be decided in some distant mountaintop gunfight, it is already unfolding here, in these smaller, almost domestic tragedies, as Dutch's family dies from the inside out while the world was changing all around them. By Beaver Hollow, the pattern is already written in blood. The gang keeps telling itself this is just a run of bad luck, just the cost of freedom, but every new grave points back to the same source. Dutch's decisions, Dutch's dream, Dutch's refusal to change while the world was changing around him. Arthur's final missions trace this pattern with cruel clarity. When he follows Dutch, when he submits to that old philosophy of grand scores and righteous robbery, disaster shadows every step. The assault on Angelo Bronte's mansion, the St. Denis bank job, the doomed chase after Cornwall's money and Angelo's betrayal, all of it flows from Dutch's insistence that one more big job will save the family. Instead, Hosea dies on the street, Lenny falls on a rooftop, Abigail is taken, and the gang is shattered. Dutch calls it sacrifice. Arthur watches it become a story of waste. After Guarma, that contrast only sharpens. Dutch drags the remnants of the gang into an escalating private war with Cornwall and the Pinkertons, forcing Arthur to raid Cornwall's refinery and ambush his train, even as the man is already dying and civilization is closing in on every outlaw. Each time Arthur rides out under Dutch's banner, someone returns broken, or not at all. Sean's easy confidence ends with his skull opened in Rhodes. Kieran's attempt at loyalty ends with his head in Dutch's camp. When Arthur helps Dutch chase the dream, the living embodiment of that dream is a trail of corpses. In the truest sense, Arthur's soul begins to turn in the opposite direction. Missions where he acts from conscience rather than command start to look very different. Helping rains fall in quieter, more measured ways, stealing documents instead of massacring soldiers, warning the Wapiti about Dutch's reckless schemes. These choices do not fix the world, but they keep it from burning quite so fast. When Arthur pushes back against Dutch's plan to turn the reservation into a battlefield, lives are spared that would have been thrown away for a gesture. The clearest break comes with John. From its humble beginnings, this gang claimed to be a family. In the end, Arthur proves it by betraying its leader. Dutch wants John left behind, written off as dead weight and betrayal. Arthur instead risks everything to free John from Sisika, to get Abigail out of St. Denis, to carve a path to that final ride toward the mountains. Each time he defies Dutch to protect them, the outcome reverses the old pattern. John lives, Abigail lives, Jack lives, and Arthur pays the price. His tuberculosis diagnosis crystallizes what his heart already knows. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's dream is one of them. Arthur realizes that every time he helps Dutch chase freedom, someone else's freedom is stolen forever. So he makes a final choice. He will die for Dutch in one sense, carrying the weight of those years, but he will also die to undo Dutch's damage, deciding whose legacy will ride on into the new century. And that choice, that last act of loyalty and betrayal intertwined, sets up the true heir to Dutch's story. That true heir does not arrive with fanfare or prophecy. He arrives on a tired horse, riding beside a dying man, as the last remnants of Dutch's dream fall apart around them. The ride to rescue Abigail is, in the truest sense, the final Van der Linde job. No grand score, no speeches about civilization and freedom, just Arthur and John pushing through the mud and gunfire of Beaver Hollow while the gang tears itself to pieces behind them. Arthur's lungs burn, his vision blurs, the world was changing in front of his eyes, but he drives himself onward because this time the prize is not money, it is John's future. From its humble beginnings, their relationship had been a story of rivalry and uneasy brotherhood, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions. Arthur had been the believer, John the deserter who once walked away from family. Now, as they cut through Pinkertons and O'Driscolls, that old dynamic reverses. John still glances back toward camp, toward Dutch, toward the only home he has known. Arthur rides forward, coughing blood, insisting there is nothing worth saving there anymore. On the way to Abigail, Arthur finally says the quiet part out loud. Dutch is lost. Dutch left Arthur to die in St. Denis. Dutch watched John rot in Sisika. Dutch keeps talking about one last job while bodies pile up around him. The man who had once been the living embodiment of frontier freedom has become a prophet of his own delusions. Arthur tells John that Dutch will never stop sacrificing them for a philosophy that died the moment Hosea did. How many graves does it take to admit the old ways were dying long before the Pinkertons closed in? John resists. Not with gunfire, but with habit, with fear. He owes Dutch everything. Dutch taught him to read, to shoot, to stand up to a world that called him an outlaw just for existing. Leaving Dutch feels like betraying a father, abandoning the last fragile idea of family he understands. Yet Abigail's capture, Jack's terror, and Hosea's empty place at the fire haunt him. What good is Dutch's approval if it keeps his son an orphan in waiting? Their final missions together become a rough reconciliation of a decade of argument. Arthur's former faith gives him insight into Dutch's methods. John's old skepticism gives him the courage to imagine life beyond them. Together, they break into the enemy's hands not for a score, but to steal back a wife and mother. Together they ride for the train, not to rob it, but to escape it. When Arthur sends John to that last horse, shoving him toward the mountains, the choice is made. John will live. Arthur will not. One rides toward a ranch, toward Abigail and Jack, toward a hard, honest life under the law. The other turns back toward Dutch, Micah, and the collapsing dream he helped build. And on that ridge, where blood, dust, and sunset meet, Dutch von der Linde is about to watch his most loyal son die for him one last time, and not in the way he expects. Arthur rides back into a dying dream and finds it bleeding on a mountaintop. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's grand philosophy has been reduced to three men circling each other with guns drawn: the prophet, the traitor, and the lost soul who finally learned to see. On that ridge, the confrontation is not just about Micah's treachery. It is a story of 20 years of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions crashing into a single moment. Arthur throws Micah's spying in Dutch's face, recalls the dead left in their wake, and forces the truth into the open. Micah snarls, lies, and twists the knife, insisting Arthur is the one who has turned, that Dutch's family is being poisoned from within. Dutch stands between them, silent, eyes moving from one son to the other, watching the family he built tear itself apart. The irony is cruel. From its humble beginnings, this gang robbed trains and banks together. Now the final score is nothing more than two men trying to rob each other of Dutch's faith. When Dutch finally raises his gun, the question hangs in the air. Who does he believe? His hesitation is the answer. He believes no one, not anymore. What follows depends on Arthur's honor, but the thematic core does not waver. In the high honor ending, beaten, coughing blood, Arthur drags himself to a rocky ledge and watches the sunrise. In the low honor path, he dies clawing and grappling with Micah, beaten to death in the dirt. One death is quiet, the other brutal, but both share the same center of gravity. Arthur's last thoughts are not of Dutch's dream of freedom, or of some grand outlaw philosophy. They are of John, Abigail, and Jack getting clear of this collapsing world. In the truest sense, Arthur dies for Dutch twice at once. His whole life has been spent serving Dutch's vision, enforcing his will, killing and stealing so the dream could live. But in the end, that same ingrained loyalty turns against its source. Arthur uses everything Dutch taught him, his toughness, his resolve, his willingness to sacrifice, to make sure Dutch cannot claim John, Jack, and Abigail as more bodies for the cause. He dies for Dutch's dream by finally refusing to let it consume another family. And then comes the coldest moment. Dutch steps away. He does not comfort Arthur, does not stay to hear last words, does not even offer the mercy of a quick death. He turns his back on both Arthur and Micah, walking into the mist, unable to face the ruin he has made. That single act severs the father-son bond completely. Whatever Dutch and Arthur were from the very beginning, they are strangers now. Later, Arthur's grave becomes the living embodiment of the game's verdict. High honor or low, it stands alone in the hills, a quiet stone bearing the weight of a fallen era. It is the most important receipt in this world, proof that Dutch's lies can devour even the best of men, but also that, at the very end, a man can choose to die for something better than an outlaw's fading dream of civilization held at gunpoint. And while Arthur's story ends on that hill, the shadow it casts over Dutch, Micah, and John is only beginning to grow. Arthur's body cools on that lonely ridge, and almost at once, the world he died to hold together comes apart. The camp does not dissolve with dignity or reflection. It explodes. One last, chaotic spasm of a dying dream. In the days after the final confrontations at Beaver Hollow and on the mountain, The Vanderlinde gang becomes a story of panic and self-preservation. Pinkerton agents and local lawmen sweep through the forests and hollows, following trails of blood, ashes, and rumor. Gunfire cracks through the trees as splintered factions of the gang clash with posses and with each other, hurling accusations of betrayal, shouting Dutch's name as if invoking a ghost that might somehow save them. Tents are abandoned half-packed, wagons are left mired in mud, and the last of the food and ammunition is burned through in desperate, directionless shootouts. With Arthur dead, Hosea gone, and Dutch vanished into the wilderness, the camp loses more than its leaders. It loses its center. For years, those two old men had been the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy, however compromised it had become. Dutch, the voice of freedom; Hosea, the voice of caution. Now there is only a vacuum. Into that vacuum step survivors like Bill Williamson, Javier Escuella, and Micah Bell, men who mistake stubbornness for loyalty and violence for purpose. They cling to whatever remains of Dutch's words, repeating his speeches about civilization and progress as if repetition could turn delusions back into ideals. Some see the writing on the wall. Karen Jones, Tilly Jackson, Pearson, and others begin to slip away, not with grand speeches, but with quiet decisions at dawn, taking a horse, a few dollars, and the chance to build some other kind of life. They have been outlaws since their humble beginnings, but the old ways were dying, and they understand that staying means becoming targets or martyrs for a man who is no longer there. Their departures are not heroic. They are necessary. Others cannot or will not imagine existence beyond the gun. Years under Dutch's influence have carved deep grooves in their souls. Men like Bill and Javier follow Micah into new hideouts and new schemes, convinced that one more score, one more bold stand against the encroaching world will redeem everything. In the truest sense, they are not chasing money. They are chasing the past. The authorities seize their moment. The Pinkertons and federal agencies use the gang's collapse as a case study, a justification, a warning. Reports are written, budgets expanded, new laws proposed. This is what happens, they argue, when civilization hesitates. The Vanderlinde gang becomes the perfect excuse to tighten the noose around the last free corners of the frontier. And then, suddenly, the story jumps. Years pass. The camps are gone, the wagons rotted, the graves half forgotten. A train pulls into a station in 1911, and one familiar face steps onto the platform. John Marston, no longer Dutch's surrogate son but a government hostage, is sent to hunt the remnants of his own family. Dutch is gone, yet his ghost walks beside John, turning every new order from the state into a grim echo of an old promise. How do you kill a man who is already dead, but whose philosophy still holds a gun to your head? The gang is in freefall, but its fall is not over. It is only changing shape. The fall of the gang becomes John Marston's second life and his second sentence. Dutch is gone into the mountains, the camps are ashes on the wind, yet the consequences of his philosophy follow John onto every horizon. When John slips away with Abigail and Jack, it is not a clean escape. It is a man dragging chains through the open fields. On a scrubby piece of land in New Austin, John tries to become something Dutch never really believed in, a settled man. He builds fences, breaks horses, teaches Jack how to shoot not for robbery, but for survival. From its humble beginnings, that ranch is meant to be a sanctuary, a small rebellion against the world that shaped him. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying only in name. The skills that kept John alive as an outlaw, tracking, killing, reading danger in a man's eyes, do not vanish. They hang over family dinners and quiet sunsets, a reminder that this peaceful story was written in stolen ink. The government does not forget him. Civilization has a long memory and a short patience. Agents of the Bureau of Investigation arrive with press suits, cold smiles, and a simple ultimatum: hunt down Bill Williamson, Javier Escuella, and Dutch Vanderlinde, or watch Abigail and Jack be taken, broken, or worse. John, who once rode against Pinkertons for Dutch's dream of freedom, is now told that his freedom exists only at the barrel of a federal gun. In that moment, the irony is almost cruel. Dutch spent decades railing against the state, promising his people that the government was the true enemy, the living embodiment of a rigged world. Now his former protege is forced to become that enemy. John rides out as a government hostage, the instrument of the very civilization Dutch swore to resist, tracking down the last remnants of the only family he ever knew. Is this justice, or a quieter form of betrayal? As John hunts Bill at Fort Mercer, chases Javier through the swamps of Nuevo Paraíso, and finally climbs toward Dutch's last refuge in the mountains, the ghost at his shoulder never stops talking. Dutch's voice lives in his suspicion of every government promise, in his refusal to trust Edgar Ross, in his bleak certainty that the game is fixed no matter who holds the cards. John may reject Dutch's delusions and cruelty, but he cannot unlearn Dutch's lesson that the world is rigged. Yet for Jack, John tries to be different. He reins in the violence where he can, pushes his son toward books instead of bullets, toward a future Dutch never really believed existed. It is, in the truest sense, a story of a man trying to build something honest from a life made of lies. But this second chance is already marked. John Marston will die in a hail of government bullets, pinned against the barn of the very ranch Dutch's choices forced him to build. Even in death, John is standing in Dutch's long shadow. Without Dutch, there would be no gang, no crimes, no Blackwater, no deal with the Bureau, no ranch, and no last stand. The next chapter is not just the end of a man. It is the final receipt for Dutch van der Linde's dream. Dutch's dream leaves one last debt unpaid, and the world comes to collect it in the mountains. John rides north under Bureau orders, chasing not just a fugitive, but the ghost of the man who made and unmade his life. The story of the van der Linde gang is about to close a circle that began in snow at Coulter and ends in snow on a different peak. Up in those jagged cliffs, Dutch has done what he always does. He has rebuilt. This time, his family is a band of disillusioned Native Americans and outcasts, people crushed beneath the same civilization he once swore to resist. To them, he sells a familiar philosophy, a story of freedom beyond the reach of the state, of a new world carved out in the high country. From its humble beginnings, his rhetoric has not changed, but the man delivering it has. Dutch is older now, the living embodiment of a dream that has rotted on the vine. The charm is thinner, the eyes colder. He has seen Blackwater, St. Denis, Beecher's Hope. He has watched railroads and telegraphs and government agents tighten their grip. The world was changing, and he finally understands that the old ways were dying, that men like him are being written out of history. Yet even with that knowledge, he refuses the simplest act of surrender. If civilization is going to win, it will not be with Dutch van der Linde in chains. John stalks him through snow and rock, through shattered camps and frightened followers who barely understand the scale of the storm they have joined. When the two men finally stand face to face on the cliff, it is not a reunion, it is a reckoning. Dutch looks at John and sees the past, the boy he raised, the outlaw son who chose a ranch, a wife, a child over the endless road. John looks at Dutch and sees the cost of that road, measured in graves. Their final conversation strips away every illusion. Dutch admits what he has always feared. They are relics, remnants of a dying age, outlaws whose time has passed. The government will not stop, he tells John, because it does not need to. It will grind forward, killing men like them until there are none left, then rewriting the story to make itself the hero. Is there any freedom in a world where the state owns the ending? So Dutch takes the ending back. Rather than let Ross's men parade him as a trophy, he steps backward off the cliff and vanishes into the chasm. It is, in the truest sense, his last act of control, a refusal to let civilization script his final moment. Yet, it is also another betrayal. His followers lose their leader without answers, without closure, abandoned mid-dream just as the gang once was. Dutch's body dies in that fall, but his damage does not. The broken families he created, the lost soul in every unmarked grave, the government emboldened by his legend, all of it rolls forward. And in the shadows of that cliff, something else is moving too, preparing to turn Dutch's legacy into a weapon John cannot escape. Dutch's body is gone, but the echo of his dream walks on two legs and carries a ranch brand instead of a gang's brand. John Marston tries to turn that echo into something gentler. Beecher's Hope is, in the truest sense, an attempt to rewrite a story of robbery and blood as a story of fences, cattle, and family dinners. On the surface, it works. The ranch stands in the sun, Abigail nags him about chores, Jack reads books about a world beyond gunsmoke. From its humble beginnings as a patch of dirt and a broken man, Beecher's Hope grows into a fragile oasis, a place where an outlaw pretends civilization has finally forgiven him. Government agents Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham promise that forgiveness, promising freedom in exchange for one last service. Hunt down the remnants of Dutch's world. Javier, Bill, Dutch himself. When that work is done, they say, John will be finished. His past will stay buried. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying on someone else's terms. The more John builds, the more the silence around him feels wrong. Ross lingers. Reports are filed. Soldiers move through the region. This is not mercy. It is bookkeeping. The state does not forget the living embodiment of Dutch's rebellion. It only waits for the right moment to close the ledger. That moment comes in dust and thunder. The day the army rides on Beecher's Hope, the illusion breaks. Riders crest the hills, rifles glint in the light, and the ranch that once felt like a sanctuary suddenly looks very small. John understands instantly. The promises were a noose, not a pardon. In a grim echo of the barn escapes of his youth, he rushes Abigail and Jack inside, shoving them toward the back doors, urging them to run for the horses and keep running. He does not beg. He does not bargain. He chooses. John steps out of the barn alone, framed by the doorway, facing a firing line of soldiers and agents who have already decided what justice means. It is an execution dressed as procedure. His last act is not a robbery or a betrayal, but a sacrifice. By standing there, by letting the guns turn him into another body in the dust, he tries to break the cycle that Dutch began at the very beginning. A cycle where children are raised under gunfire and taught that freedom only comes from the barrel of a rifle. If someone must die for Dutch's dream one last time, John decides it will be him, not his son. Yet his death is still Dutch's bill coming due. Without Dutch's philosophy, without those years as a loyal protege and public outlaw, John would never have become the man the government needed to erase. His killing is the state's delayed response to Dutch's rebellion, the final proof that even a reformed gunman cannot outrun the story. Civilization has written for him. John's grave beside Beecher's Hope is the last great receipt in this saga. A husband, a father, a former thief, buried under a simple wooden cross, watched over by the ranch he died to protect. It stands as quiet evidence that Dutch's idea of freedom created men the new America felt compelled to kill, even after they tried to change, even after they tried to build instead of burn. And as the years pass and the grass grows over that mound of earth, Dutch's shadow still stretches forward, reaching for the next generation, waiting to see whether Jack Marston will accept the peace his father bought, or reopen the account his father died to close. Jack Marston grows up in that shadow, in the long echo of gunfire he barely remembers. His childhood is a story of motion and fear, of whispered names and half-truths, of a boy carried from camp to camp while the adults around him pretend this is normal family life. From its humble beginnings in snowbound Coulter to the muddy fields near Rhodes, Jack is the quiet center of a storm he cannot understand. He hears Dutch's name as a legend before he ever grasps it as a warning. Around the fire, Arthur, Hosea, and the others soften the edges, turning robberies into adventures and near-death escapes into heroic tales. Dutch is described as the living embodiment of freedom, a man who stands against a cruel civilization and refuses to kneel. To a child, that philosophy sounds pure, almost noble. The blood, the betrayals, the delusions that prop it up are kept out of earshot. Then the world changes. The old ways were dying, and the gang with them. Jack is taken, traded, hidden, moved. The Rhodes feud, the St. Denis disaster, the final flight to Beaver Hollow, these become blurred memories of raised voices and sudden departures. By the time the dust settles and the Van der Linde gang is gone, Jack is left with fragments. A father trying to be better, a mother exhausted by running, and a name, Dutch, that now hangs in the air like a question no one wants to answer. On the ranch, the story seems to change. John and Abigail try to bury the past under fences and cattle, trading outlaw chaos for the dull rhythm of honest labor. Jack finally has space to read, to dream, to imagine a life of words instead of bullets. He studies adventure novels and tales of civilization, of courts and cities and ordered worlds where problems are solved with arguments, not ambushes. In the truest sense, he wants out. But the past refuses to stay buried. When Edgar Ross orchestrates John's death, when federal power reaches into that quiet valley and tears the Marston family apart, the cycle Dutch once preached against simply closes its fist around a new generation. Jack tracks Ross not as an outlaw raised in the gang, but as a son walking into a role he never wanted. A boy of books becomes a man with a gun. Here, the irony cuts deepest. Jack, who loved stories more than shootouts, becomes the final page of his father's unfinished chapter. He hunts Ross to the riverbank, calls him out, and kills him in a formal duel that mirrors every showdown Dutch's war with the state ever produced. Freedom and vengeance, loyalty and loss, all condensed into a single pull of the trigger. Then, pattern breaks. Pull back from Jack, from Ross, from that one small patch of water and dust. Imagine the whole American landscape, dotted with graves, Jenny and Davy in unmarked soil, Hosea and Lenny beneath the city that killed them, Arthur on a lonely ridge, John on a hill above his ranch. What did all these deaths add up to? A victory for civilization? A warning about freedom? Or just the quiet truth that Dutch's war did not end with his fall? It simply changed hands, passing its weight onto a boy who never truly knew him, but still walks the road his ghost laid out. Jack rides away from the river, and the story of the Van der Linde gang rides with him. No longer confined to outlaws, now written into the bloodline of the new America, Jack rides away. But the question he leaves behind is heavier than any gun on his hip. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, who truly pulled the trigger on all those lives buried in the gang's shadow? On the surface, the villains seem obvious. Micah Bell is the traitor within, the snake at the campfire, whispering poison into Dutch's ear while secretly serving the Pinkertons. The agents themselves, Ross and Milton, are the cold hand of civilization, hunting the gang from the mountains of Coulter to the swamps of Shady Bell, determined to make an example of these outlaws. Behind them stand men like Cornwall and the unseen industrialists, the living embodiment of a new America, buying railroads, towns, and politicians, proving that in this world money robs better than any gun. They are cruel, they are corrupt, but they are not enough. Because none of them explain why so many men and women chose to ride into hell for Dutch van der Linde long before a badge or a bullet forced their hand. From its humble beginnings, the gang could have scattered at the first sign of real pressure. Instead, they doubled down, again and again, even as the old ways were dying all around them. The deeper villain is quieter and far more seductive, Dutch's philosophy itself. From the very beginning, he preached freedom without responsibility, family without accountability, violence as justice. It was an intoxicating creed, promising that every robbery was resistance, every killing a blow against a rigged civilization. In the truest sense, it turned crime into a cause and made running from the law feel like running toward a better world. That dream is what held Arthur for more than 20 years, dying inside for Dutch long before he coughed blood on that final mountainside. It is what kept Hosea at Dutch's side even after Bessie's death, convincing himself that one last score would finally buy the quiet life they had postponed for decades. Lenny, educated, thoughtful, fluent in more than one language, believed that riding into the St. Denis Bank was not just suicide, but a step toward a future where men like him could finally breathe. Sean survived countless gunfights, only to die in an ambush made possible because Dutch ignored every warning that Cornwall's men were closing in. Good people, or at least people capable of goodness, wrapped themselves in Dutch's words and rode straight into the grave. Arthur, Hosea, Lenny, Sean, each accepted terrible risks because the dream told them their sacrifices were righteous, that death in Dutch's service was better than life under anyone else's rule. So when every grave tied to the Van der Linde gang is lined up in the mind's eye, where does the blame truly rest? With the traitor who twisted the man, the system that cornered him, or the dream they all chose to believe in even as the world was changing beyond recognition? The answer lies in the way the gang's story mirrors a much larger one. From its humble beginnings as a ragged band of dreamers hiding from the law, the Van der Linde gang becomes a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom promised and freedom denied. In the truest sense, it is the living embodiment of the American myth, pioneers pushing into hostile territory, convinced that their cause justifies whatever must be done to survive. Dutch speaks the language of that myth fluently. He talks about liberty and tyrants, about civilization crushing the individual, about righteous violence against a corrupt system. This is not new in that world. It echoes the rhetoric of revolutionaries and expansionists who claimed that the land was theirs by right, that bloodshed was unfortunate but necessary, that the ends could sanctify the means. When Dutch tells his followers that robbery is rebellion, that killing Pinkertons is self-defense, he blurs the line between outlaw and patriot until his gang cannot see where one ends and the other begins. For Arthur, Hosea, Lenny, and the rest, Dutch's philosophy offers a way to turn crime into a cause. Robbing a bank in St. Denis becomes striking a blow against civilization. Slaughtering O'Driscolls becomes frontier justice. Each heist, each gunfight, each body left in the mud is framed as part of a grand campaign against an oppressive world. Who would not die for that, especially a lost soul with nowhere else to belong? But the state has its own story to tell. The government's response to Dutch's gang is not just a manhunt, it is a familiar pattern. Surveillance through informants like Micah, militarized law enforcement in the form of Pinkertons and soldiers, and propaganda that paints the gang as monsters rather than desperate idealists all mirror how real nations respond to internal threats. The more Dutch rages against the system, the more that system justifies harsher methods until the chase itself becomes a performance about order-crushing chaos. Here, the graves scattered across the map begin to read like historical footnotes. Jenny, Davy, and Mac after Blackwater, Sean and Rhodes, Hosea and Lenny in St. Denis, Arthur on that mountain, John at Beecher's Hope. Each stone is a quiet reminder that grand ideals, whether Dutch's dream of freedom or America's march of progress, usually demand blood from those least equipped to question the cost. The leaders write the speeches, the followers fill the ground, then the frame slips. This is no longer just a tale about fictional outlaws in a fading West. What draws such fascination to this gang, to their campfires and codes, to their doomed belief that one more score will fix everything? That same pull toward romance, toward a story that explains the world in simple terms of us and them, is the very thing that keeps Dutch's people riding behind him long after the old ways were dying. And as the saga moves toward its final reckonings, that romance will be tested against something far more unforgiving than Dutch's words: consequences that cannot be talked away, and a future that refuses to make room for them. Consequences have names. They have faces, graves, and half-finished stories, and the Van der Linde gang leaves them scattered from Blackwater to Beecher's Hope. From the very beginning of the final act, the Blackwater ferry job becomes the original sin. Davy Callender dies bleeding in the snow at Coulter. Jenny Kirk never even reaches the screen alive, and Matt Callender is gunned down off-camera in a failed rescue. 3 early believers erased by one overreaching plan, all because Dutch insists that a big score will buy them freedom from civilization. Their deaths are the down payment on a dream that never arrives. The pattern only deepens as the gang runs south. Sean McGuire, loud, reckless, forever boasting about his own legend, survives years as an outlaw only to be dropped in an instant by a sniper's bullet in Rhodes. Dutch marches them into the Braithwaite-Gray feud, convinced he can play both sides, and Sean pays the price for that arrogance. His jokes, his stories, the way he needles Arthur and Lenny during that drunken St. Denis night, all of it cut short because Dutch cannot resist turning every town into a stage for his philosophy. At camp, the fallout grows more intimate, more cruel. Kieran Duffy, once an O'Driscoll, tries desperately to prove his loyalty, tending horses, fetching supplies, clinging to the idea that this outlaw family will accept him. Instead, he is kidnapped, tortured, and decapitated, his body delivered to Beaver Hollow as a message. Dutch had promised protection. What arrives is a corpse, and another lost soul written off as expendable. Molly O'Shea, drunk, jealous, perhaps lying, perhaps not, stumbles into Dutch's paranoia and Susan Grimshaw's gun. Dutch does nothing to save her. Silence becomes its own kind of betrayal. In St. Denis, the dream collapses in the truest sense. Hosea Matthews, the living embodiment of the gang's better angels, walks into the bank job knowing Dutch is slipping, yet still trusting the man he once rode with from its humble beginnings. He dies on the gallows of a Pinkerton setup, and Dutch's response is not grief but fury, a rage that drags Lenny Summers onto the rooftops. Lenny, the educated young man who reads late at night and talks about a world beyond outlaw life, is cut down in the smoke and chaos of Dutch's grand gesture. And then comes Arthur on the mountain, lungs ruined, faith shattered, still choosing to buy time for John Marston to escape. Arthur's journal entries, his sketches, his quiet reflections on what Dutch used to be, turn his final stand into more than a shootout. It is a reckoning with every compromise he made in Dutch's name. John himself, years later at Beecher's Hope, dies on his own front porch, but that death is also a receipt. The Pinkertons hunt him because of the man he once followed. Around them orbit still more ghosts: Annabelle, Bessie, unnamed outlaws and innocents caught in crossfire, towns burned, families ruined. How many graves does it take before a philosophy is called what it truly is, a story of dreams that curdled into delusions? So with all these lives spent, all this blood laid at the altar of Dutch's idea of freedom, what did his dream actually leave behind? The answer is coming, and it is far smaller and far heavier than Dutch ever promised. In the end, Dutch's grand design does not leave a new world or a revolution in its wake. It leaves scattered lives, scattered graves, and a handful of people trying to turn blood money into something quieter than gunfire. That is the real monument to his dream. From its humble beginnings around a campfire, the gang imagined itself as the living embodiment of freedom, an outlaw family standing against a corrupt civilization. What actually survives is far smaller: a few crumpled bills laundered through ranches and shacks, a widow in a cabin, a scarred man on a reservation, a boy on a distant farm reading books about a West that never truly existed. The legend grows larger than the people, while the people are the ones who pay for the legend. Abigail Roberts carries that contradiction in the truest sense. Once a camp follower passed between men, she becomes the spine holding what remains of the family together. The stolen dollars John earns under Dutch's banner help buy Beecher's Hope, but every fence post on that land is hammered in with ghosts. Her loyalty turns away from Dutch's philosophy and toward Jack's future, yet the trauma never really leaves. It only quiets. Jack Marston inherits even more. He is Dutch's promise made flesh and Dutch's failure made permanent, a child raised on stories of freedom and forced to grow up over bodies in the snow. His education, his books, his eventual life in the East are all paid for with robberies he never chose. Is it any wonder that when John dies, Jack steps back onto the outlaw path he was supposed to escape? The dream follows him, long after the dreamers are gone. Even those who slip the noose, like Tilly Jackson or Mary Beth, carry this mixed legacy. Tilly finds a decent husband, a real home, a place in civilization, yet her past is a shadow at the edge of every happy scene. Charles Smith disappears north, a lost soul searching for a land untouched by the old ways of men like Dutch, knowing the world was changing faster than any one survivor could keep up. The games themselves understand this. They turn the Van der Linde saga into a story of myth-making, inviting players to feel the pull of Dutch's speeches, the warmth of the campfire, the thrill of the ride, and then forcing a walk through graveyards and ruined towns. Every mission is a sermon followed by a funeral. Every rousing call to arms ends with another name carved into stone. That is where the real lessons sit, in the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Charismatic leaders who claim simple answers to complex injustices. Ideals that begin as resistance and end as rationalizations. Loyalty that slowly becomes self-destruction, one small compromise at a time. Does it happen only with outlaws and six-shooters, or in quieter corners of the modern world as well? Understanding why so many died for Dutch is not just an exercise in lore, it is a mirror. It shows how dreams can curdle, how families can be twisted into weapons, how a story of freedom can become a cage. And as the last survivors ride off into uncertain futures, one question hangs in the air, waiting for the next part of this tale. When the dream is gone, what kind of person is left standing in its shadow? The question that lingers in that shadow is not abstract. It has names, faces, and graves scattered across a world where the old ways were dying and men clung to dreams that could not survive the march of civilization. So the story turns outward for a moment and asks, among all those who fell for Dutch's dream of freedom, whose loss cut the deepest? For many, it will always be Arthur, the man who kept dying inside for Dutch long before his body finally gave out on that mountain. Raised from the very beginning by Dutch and Hosea, he was the living embodiment of the gang's promise and its betrayal, a son who realizes too late that the father he trusted has become a stranger. Others will point to Hosea, Dutch's oldest partner, whose death in St. Denis is not just a tactical loss but the end of the gang's conscience, the moment the philosophy loses its last anchor in reality. Some will remember Lenny, the idealistic young scholar turned outlaw, who could read Latin and debate politics but never got the chance to grow old. He dies in a chaotic rooftop escape Dutch insisted was their only way out, a bright future erased in a heartbeat. Others still feel Sean's absence most, the loud, reckless survivor of 100 scrapes, casually dropped by a sniper in Rhodes after Dutch ignored the warning signs. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, narrows down to a single shot from the trees. Yet there are quieter names that haunt the margins. Kieran, the kidnapped O'Driscoll who tried to earn a place in this fractured family and paid for it with a brutal death meant as a message. Jenny, lost in the snow after Blackwater, barely remembered except as one more casualty of a plan that went wrong before the game even began. Which of these lost soul figures deserves an entire saga of their own, a dedicated descent into who they were before Dutch's orbit pulled them in? Imagine an episode that follows Hosea's greatest cons from its humble beginnings, or one that steps into Lenny's inner life, from his father's murder to his restless search for purpose. Picture a full chronicle of Sean's years before the gang, drifting between prisons, wars, and doomed rebellions. A pinned comment in a poll will stand as the campfire tonight. Whose story should be told next, and who was the most loyal to Dutch in the truest sense? Arthur, Hosea, Lenny, or another name buried in the background? For those who have ridden this far into the tale, the path ahead is only getting darker and richer. There are still countless stories hidden in the margins, long-form breakdowns of characters who shaped this world and then vanished from it. And in the next chapter, the perspective will turn, not to those who died for Dutch, but to those who survived him, and the terrible price they paid to walk away from the dream. Before Dutch died, his dream killed almost everyone who believed in him. Long before that last step off the cliff, the true ending had already been written in gunpowder, in blood, and in the quiet grass around 100 unmarked graves. From its humble beginnings, this was always a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and torn apart by greed. At the very beginning, there was laughter in a saloon, two conmen trying to rob each other and somehow finding a shared philosophy instead. Dutch and Hosea spoke of freedom and justice, of standing against a rigged civilization, and for a moment the world seemed wide open. The old ways were dying, and the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. But every promise had a price. Every grave in this tale is a receipt for one of Dutch's lies or half-truths, a quiet ledger of all the times belief outweighed reality. Jenny and Davy lost in the snow after Blackwater. Sean dropped in an instant on a dusty road. Hosea and Lenny gunned down in the bright cruelty of St. Denis. Arthur and John, each dying on a lonely height, paying in full for a philosophy that had stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as pieces on a board. The journey from campfire laughter to those windswept hills is epic in scope and intimate in its cruelty. It begins with Arthur Morgan as the living embodiment of Dutch's dream, a lost soul turned into a true believer, and ends with that same man coughing blood on a mountain, finally seeing the world as it really is. It follows John Marston from reckless surrogate son to hunted family man, standing on his porch as the last echoes of the gang's sins ride toward him in government coats. It stretches from the muddy streets of Valentine to the rooftops of St. Denis, from the swamps of Lemoyne to the frozen peaks above Beaver Hollow. Each place another step down into the grave, Dutch was digging for everyone who loved him. Yet the dead of the von der Linde gang were not mindless followers. They were, in the truest sense, complex, often good-hearted outlaws reaching for something better. Lenny, educated and sharp, chasing dignity in a world that refused him. Hosea, tired and wise, clinging to the belief that the dream could still be steered toward mercy. Charles and Sadie, Arthur and John, all searching for family, justice, or simply a place to belong while the world was changing faster than any of them could understand. Is it any wonder they held on to the one man who promised that nothing had to change? So the camera pulls back one last time. A hillside of stones and crooked wooden markers, some named, some forgotten. The wind moves through the grass and carries, just for a heartbeat, the faint echo of Dutch van der Linde preaching about freedom, about loyalty, about a future that never came. Then, even that echo fades, swallowed by distance and by time. In the end, what remains is a story of people who tried to live free and paid the ultimate price for another man's dream. Their lives may be fictional, but their questions linger. What is owed to family? When does loyalty become self-betrayal? How far can a philosophy bend before it breaks the people who believe in it? This chapter closes with a quiet thanks for walking among these graves and remembering the names carved into them. Let those names ride on in memory, and let the questions they raise follow into whatever tale comes next.